Chapter 1426. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 1426. What can stop us? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina left the Senate branch after completing a few other things. But Lionel still seemed lost in thought, as though he was still trying to work something out. What's wrong? Aina asked. From what Lionel had said earlier, it sounded as if all their troubles were dealt with. Did my cousin say anything else to you? Anything that might sound suspicious? Anything that stood out? Aina fell deep into her thoughts, but after a moment, she shook her head. She couldn't think of anything like that. Back then, she had been very focused on the contract and negotiations, so she had practically memorized every little thing CEO said. But, even then, she couldn't come up with anything like what Lionel had asked for. Is there a problem? I'm not sure. Lionel said honestly. It just feels too easy. On the one hand, the void merit rule should be rarely used. Void merits alone are difficult to gather in the first place. Although you'll have almost 200 at the end of this month, there are very few people who could boast such a thing. The number of individuals on the leaderboards to begin with are barely a fraction of the number of students in the Void Palace, and that doesn't even consider the fact that only the top 3 get to enjoy void merits in return in the first place. Then there's the fact that anyone who could earn void merits through any method to begin with wouldn't normally be people that would need to get out of a contract. They would be geniuses that would be easily taken in by a faction or party without issue. Something like selling themselves in exchange for help would never happen. So, that would make the use of this rule even rarer. Then that should be a good thing. Why are you worried? Like I said, it just feels too easy. If my cousin is intelligent, he'll look at things from all angles. He should know both how valuable void merits are and the fact that you'll earn a lot in just a couple more weeks. If I was him, this chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Lionel's gaze went into a daze for a moment as he activated an ability he had only just created. He called it Dream Perspective. With Dream Perspective, he could forget the things he knew and only remember the things his target would. This way, he wouldn't have his thoughts colored by bias and matters he already understood. One of the most difficult things for people to do was look at matters from the perspective of someone else. However, with Tier 4, Control, Lionel could create a dream clone in his dream world that had the exact knowledge of whoever he chose. Then, he could simulate how they would think about a situation. The more understanding he had of a person, the more accurate it would be. He could adjust his intelligence and deductive ability, as well as factor in personality and tendencies as well. But, since Lionel knew so little about his cousin, he could only draw conclusions with about 20 to 30% certainty, using an average 6-dimensional existence as his dream clone. I would be cautious. With the importance of void merits, why give a chance for this variable to pop up and bite me in the ass at all? There are too many ways to circumvent that problem. The easiest way to do things would be to shrink the deadline. Rather than a month, I would give you 2 weeks. 2 weeks is still semi-reasonable, especially since neither of us would be aware that the clinic would mark up the price so much just because of a grudge they had with me. Now that I think about it, a month is overly nice. It's possible that he's greedy, Aina supplemented, though he didn't say anything that could give away his real goal. He did say, I never touched the women of my brothers. However, I will take their money, to me. NovelBin. Lionel's brows raised as he fell into thought again. There are too many possibilities. The problem wasn't that Lionel couldn't think of what CEO might do. The real issue was that he could think of too many. And, without knowing exactly what CEO knew, it was impossible to pinpoint which path he could take. For example, it would be all too easy to close the loophole he and Aina planned on using. CEO would only have to be demoted back down to Aina's level, then she wouldn't be able to use void merits to escape the chains of the contract. Of course, whether CEO would go so far, Lionel didn't know. But, if it was Lionel, if he could force a talent like Aina to work for him, that would be worth exchanging whatever effort it took for him to raise his level. Aina was someone who had entered 20 leaderboards in her first attempt, Where else would you find a talent like that? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. In fact, now that Lionel knew the rule book inside and out, he could even think of some methods where demoting your rank would be a benefit rather than a detriment. Since there are too many possibilities, disregard them all. Aina suddenly said. Aina blinked and looked up at Lionel with a smile. I told you before that your battle style isn't like mine. You like withholding your trump cards and only using them when you can get maximum benefit. But, I just give everything I have right from the very beginning. So what if you know what's coming? You can't stop it anyway. Lionel's gaze glowed, his heartbeat speeding up. That was right. Instead of trying to think of a counter for everything CO might do, he just needed to find a method he couldn't block no matter what. It's no wonder his spear force was so lacking. He had the disposition of an archer, not a spearman. Thought of something? Aina's smile widened. Maybe. But it will be difficult. Lionel responded. What could possibly stop us if we do it together? Aina asked. Hearing such words, what else could Lionel do other than grin? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1427. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 24 seconds AM. Chapter 1427. Sly Brad. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Previous chapter has already been updated. It's been brought to my attention that for those that can't see the update, you can go to a profile setting a clear cache. Then the chapter will refresh. Thanks to Horst for enlightening me to this method, Lionel and Aina returned to the Senate branch, finding that the young man had yet to leave. You two again? I already warned you, you know. You can't return missions you've already taken. You're going to have to bite the bullet. If you fail to complete a mission, you not only fall in debt for 10 times what the reward would be, but you also get assigned manual labor. The time scope of the manual labor is fairly harsh, though it can sometimes be lenient. It all depends since you'll be on duty until the mission you failed is completed. Lionel's expression flickered. He could think of a ton of ways to abuse rules like that, especially if he was the head of a powerful faction. But, he also didn't plan on failing any missions, so he ignored those thoughts for now. These days, his mind worked faster than he even wanted to, so he winded down paths others wouldn't even consider before said individual could even begin deducing much of anything. We know, we just thought we'd pick out another mission to save on some time so that we can complete them all at once. The young man, who Lionel knew by name now as Dmitri, raised an eyebrow. But, he didn't question it. After Lionel and Aina had left, he looked into them to see what he had missed and he learned that these two were two of this year's only 3 amethyst token wielders. Aina's performance was shocking enough, but Lionel's was especially, well, eye-catching. If you aren't reading this on Novelbin, you're reading pirated content. Please support the official release. Though many felt that Lionel's performance was definitely fake, some more analytical individuals felt that there was more to this than met the eye. The reason was quite simple. The Void Senate and the Void Elders never attempted to close down the Void Tower. If there was something wrong with the Void Tower, wouldn't they at least close it down for a while to see what could have gone wrong? And yet right before Lionel's run and right after, everything was business as usual. It made one wonder. Did he really climb to the 74th floor? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. No matter how Dmitri scanned Lionel, he could find nothing special about him. He couldn't fathom how a 5th-dimensional kid could climb to even the 20s, let alone the 70s. It just didn't make any sense. Of course, this was one of the other odd changes Lionel had undergone. The more time he spent in this new body of his, the more subtle changes he noticed. For example, his aura and his temperament seemed to have been greatly refined, not even the tiniest bit of his aura leaked anymore. In the past, when he focused, he used to leak out King's might, causing everyone around him to feel strained and heavy. But now, he focused and nothing at all happened. He hadn't noticed earlier because Aina had always been unbothered by his King's might. But, with Dimitri here, he should have sensed or felt something. But, Lionel could tell that he hadn't. We will take the Goblin Subdimensional Zone Void mission. Dimitri was speechless as he had flashbacks to just before Lionel and Aina had left the first time. They had already had this talk once before, but Dimitri never thought that these two would come back only to ignore everything he had said the first time. He almost felt like banging his head against the wall. Had he been talking to air? Void missions could appear at all ranks from quadrant to domain. They were essentially missions that hadn't been completed within a 10-year span. Usual missions were ranked 1 to 9. Level 1 Galaxy missions were designed for Level 1 Galaxy ranked disciples, so on and so forth. A 1-star Void mission was one that hadn't been completed in 10 years of activity. A 2-star Void mission hadn't been completed in 100 years. A 3-star Void mission hadn't been completed in 1,000. And a Death Void mission was anything beyond that. The Goblin mission wasn't yet a Death Void mission, but it wasn't far from that. And, even before it became a 1-star Void mission, it had been a Level 3 Galaxy-ranked mission. That level was already suicide for the likes of Lionel and Aina, leaderboard prodigies, or not. For reference, a Level 1 Galaxy-ranked mission was already designed for 6th-dimensional existences. In fact, the only current 5th-dimensional existence that could be considered Galaxy-ranked was Aina herself, with Lionel being unranked. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. Didn't we already agree that? We changed our minds. Lionel smiled. And you're aware that, we know. Lionel smiled brighter. Fine, fine. Dimitri tossed over the mission plate and shook his head, watching the two of them leave once again. If they couldn't complete both missions they had taken within a week, they would be off to do labor. Wait. Dimitri shot up from his chair, finding the specific pendant he was looking for. He poured his internal sight into it. When he read what was on the other end, he laughed and shook his head. Huh, what a loophole. Lionel had been certain to claim the mission himself. Aina never even touched the mission plate. The trouble was that as an unranked disciple, there was nothing for the mission to be registered to. The penalties for completing a mission weren't universal. They were decided by the rank of the disciple and the rank of the mission in question. If a Galaxy-ranked disciple wanted to claim a sector-ranked mission, they would not only need to pass the test, but if they failed, the punishment was actually doubled. In fact, not only were the punishments tied to your rank as a disciple, but even the location of our menial labor would be tied to it as well. After all, if they sent Galaxy-ranked and sector-ranked disciples to the same place, all of the former would likely die. This meant one thing: as an unranked disciple, Lionel couldn't be punished even if he failed a mission. A sly brat indeed. Well, good luck. Most who take on void missions don't even get to return to be punished in the first place. Chapter 1428. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 1428. Goblin Race. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina quickly made it to the location of their first mission. They chose to get the easier one out of the way first just so that they could get used to what was happening. Then they would tackle the void mission. Missions were separated into a few categories, but the main ones were land missions, zone missions, and void battlefield missions, and finally, outside missions. Land missions were missions that took place on Void Palace land itself. These could range from anything like Dimitri's job to clearing cursed beasts. Void battlefield missions spoke for themselves, while outside missions were like what Lionel's mother had undertaken to oversee the selection. If you aren't reading this on novelbin, you're reading pirated content. Please support the official release. Finally, zone missions happened to be the category both of their couple's chosen missions fell under. These were subdimensional zones that were opened in Void Palace territory, and those that fell under this umbrella tended to be the most complex to deal with. Of course, all of the subdimensional zones of the Void Palace had long since been cleared. They no longer needed to worry about their lands being swallowed or dissolved by history. However, there were many unique zones that the Void Palace kept open with methods similar to what Valiant Heart Mountain had done. The only difference was that the Void Palace did it on a much larger scale. It had to be remembered that unique zones were defined as zones that had been influenced by outside factors. This could range from anything like outsiders entering when they shouldn't, outsiders influencing the timeline of events, and even up to keeping zones that should have been closed long ago, open. Unique zones that fell into the third category were used for their continual supplementation of resources. However, the issue was that the longer these unique zones remained open, the more twisted their inner worlds became and the more difficult they were to deal with. In order to keep the zones within manageable levels, missions were released to the disciples. So long as these missions were completed within a timely fashion, everything would be fine and the Void Palace would be able to continuously mine resources. However, in case of failure, well, there was a reason why void missions were so dangerous. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com. To experience faster update speed due to their inherent qualities, zone missions tended to become void missions far more often than missions of other categories. And, likewise, they also tended to be the ones that most often became death void missions as well. Knowing this, it was no wonder that Dimitri had had just a fierce reaction. Still, Lionel and Aina had made the decision and it was already much too late to back out now. Hello. Lionel gave a small greeting to the senior manning the zone and handed over their mission plate. With a nod, the senior slotted in the force crystals necessary and opened the pathway. You have a week before the zone closes. Be sure to complete the mission before then. Lionel nodded and took Aina's hand as he jumped in, the portals swirling close after them. The senior manning the post couldn't help but blink and shake his head, trying to rid himself of the daze he fell into after noticing Aina. When Lionel's vision cleared, he found himself in the depths of a familiar forest. The soil was still a grayish-black, the surroundings were still layered in a dense fog, and the anarchic force was still thick. The only difference was that the trees were all burnt to the ground, leaving a thick heat and smell of ash and soot in the air. Up ahead, there was a looming castle built right in the face of a wall. Several sentries marched along and patrolled the area. Considering the situation, it wouldn't be long before he and Aina were found out. However, Lionel wasn't worried. This mission was the easier of the two and was only a level 1 galaxy-ranked mission. The good news about this was that thanks to the mission details, Lionel didn't need the dictionary to find out what they had to do to clear the zone. In fact, they even got a history of the situation. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. Many of these zones were back before the humans conquered this region. The Void Palace was located on the frontier of the human domain. So, as one might imagine, it wasn't always in human hands. In order to claim it and push back the line of defense to the Void battlefield, many other races had to be cleared away first. This mission targeted one of these former races and also happened to be related to the goblin race he and Aina would be facing in the 3-star Void mission he had chosen. The so-called goblin race was just a nickname given to humans and it was honestly quite derogatory, though Lionel wasn't aware of this. The true name of the race was the Dwarven race. However, the Dwarven race was unlike what Lionel was used to, they simply referred to small humanoids. Their females were known as pixies and their males were known as sparrows. They had skin ranging from dull gray to dark green, transparent wings that seemed too frail to carry their weight, and they ranged from 3 to 5 feet tall upon reaching maturity. They were well known for their speed, cunning, and their ability to build into natural barriers and constructs. This race was especially troublesome to deal with, especially when they had time to prepare. This was why the timeline of this mission was a week instead of just a day, despite the fact the goal was very straightforward: kill. Lionel exhaled a breath as a blaring horn sounded. It seemed that he and Aina had been found. He subconsciously flipped over a palm, but he shook his head in the end. His bows were in the segmented cube before the incident and his spears were all locked away thanks to the volatile atmosphere in the spear domain ring. Readjusting himself, Lionel flipped a palm again, a familiar spear landing in his hand. This spear was the very same stinger-like spear he had gained after becoming a woman during his spear domain trial. He couldn't help but laugh when he remembered the ridiculousness of the situation. Since then, he had experienced becoming a woman more times than he could count, but now was the time to linger on that. It was time to see how this new body of his performed. He turned to Aina and grinned before they both bolted forward. Chapter 1429. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 21 seconds AM. Chapter 1429. Feel LT if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel shot forward and his head almost snapped back as though someone had just pressed on the gas. His speed was so fast that he almost didn't believe that it was being generated from his own legs. What was the most shocking about it was the fact that his weight hadn't been lowered in the slightest, unlike what had happened when his snowy star owl lineage factor's speed branch reached its peak. Somehow, he managed to hit this pace with his weight being just as great as it had been before. He appeared before the castle walls almost too quickly. Realizing that he would crash if he didn't adjust, Lionel focused, his thighs bulging as he leapt into the air. Wah! Lionel let out a gasp. Before he realized what was happening, he was already 50 meters in the air, his eyes opened wide. Jumping 50 meters into the air wasn't a big deal if he was in a fifth-dimensional world. He might even be able to replicate the feat if he put his all into it in a sixth-dimensional world. But, just now, he thought he had already adjusted himself to his new strength, so he used even less than he thought he should. And yet, the result was still like this. Lionel suddenly understood. The speed of the starry-tailed fox was amazing, but somehow it was still secondary compared to its leaping, directional change, and agility abilities. He laughed in the skies, making it to almost 60 meters before he began to fall downward. Aina clicked her tongue, still quite far behind Lionel. She had adjusted her speed based on what output she was used to Lionel producing. This was clearly also outside her expectations. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Calm to experience faster update speed. She smiled lightly after a moment, her body becoming enveloped in a fog of crimson as she exploded forth, her palm flipping over to reveal her axe. In the skies, Lionel's gaze flashed, his vision suddenly able to see through everything. His internal sight enveloped the entire mountain castle as several arrows shot toward him. Lionel brandished his spear, its feather fluttering in the wind as he pierced forward. Protected by his spear force, he met the tip of each and every arrow, his speed leaving afterimages in the air as he thought back to the style of the primitive woman. It had been so long since he sunk into her thoughts, and yet he was back there again as though the first time he touched the spear was just yesterday. He seemed to be able to grasp many subtleties he had completely missed back when he was just in the third dimension. No, he hadn't just missed them, it was like he wasn't looking for them at all. The truth was that even now, he wasn't looking for them. It was just that his senses were so far superior to what they had been back then that he almost had no choice but to notice. The subtle but powerful twist of her hips, the way her feet grinded into the ground as though to gain the support of the earth with her every strike, the almost insignificant flex and turn of her wrist just before her strike landed. For a moment, Lionel was in a daze. The process felt eerily similar to him. How different was brandishing a spear compared to throwing a football? Or, more pertinently, a javelin? The mechanisms were slightly different, but the methods and foundation of drawing up and producing power were nearly identical. Visit N0 Velbin. Net or No Velbin. Com for the best novel reading experience. He could draw on the same concepts, that natural motion that came as easy as breathing to him. He never had to think when he drew his bow or when he cocked his arm back to release the draconic power in his arm, but that was also because he had drilled the latter so many times that it came so naturally. When had he ever put so much effort into the spear? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. And what about the former? With a bow, much of the mechanics were taken out of his hands, but now that he thought about it, there were many small tweaks he could make to his bowmanship that could take him to a different level entirely. The bow was only more forgiving because he could make up all his mechanical flaws with his calculative abilities. Who cared if his arm wasn't straight, if his back wasn't tight, if his shoulders weren't steady, if he could always just adjust the angle or his bow force so that his aim was true every time? Lionel went through all these thoughts in just the split moment it took for him to fall onto the castle walls. In just those small split seconds, his entire demeanor had shifted and changed, his approach changing entirely. He had the perfect ability to perfect his mechanics to an absolute extreme, and yet he had never used it. He would change that. Starting right now. Lionel stomped down hard, his hair fluttering and his aura becoming restrained. He pierced forward, his spear force jetting forward and leaving a hole in the heads of 2 sparrows and a pixie. Their small frames and ridiculous speed and agility was exactly the kind of challenge he needed right now. Lionel restrained his aura even further, not relying on any force other than his spear force and lowering his speed even further. These were just fifth-dimensional enemies for now. He wouldn't be satisfied until his skill alone could overwhelm them. Come. His base was steady, his wrists flexed and his back tall. He walked forward like a mountain, his every pierce becoming more refined, the wind around him shifting as a slight auspicious air began to form as he became more focused. By the 10th pierce, Lionel had reflected the skill of the primitive woman perfectly. Every twitch of the muscle, every subtle movement, even the angle she grinded her feet into the ground at. But he wasn't satisfied. There was more here. He could feel it. Chapter 1430. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 20 a.m. Chapter 1430. Whistle if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's spear flew like a jet stream, leaving blurs in the air as he pierced through head after head. His lethality only increased, and yet his speed seemed to only become slower. It wasn't a surprise that Lionel had only taken 10 pierces to reach the level of the primitive woman. After all, his ability index was perfect for this, and this was ultimately just a black-grade weapon. But he still basked in the feeling. He could sense it, there was a level beyond. There was a level that represented why this woman's spear would be in the spear domain. This wasn't enough to gain the acknowledgement of the spear, there was something he was still missing. 3 sparrows shot toward Lionel, each of them just 4 feet tall. But, because they were all flying low to the ground, their heights were no less than that of Lionel. 2 wielded short swords and the last was an archer who lagged behind. These 3 were most definitely more powerful than the ones Lionel had been fighting until this point, each of them in the latter third of the 5th dimension, beyond even Lionel's tier 6 level. However, Lionel didn't flinch, his pale violet irises twinkling with a hidden light as the auspicious air around him thickened. This chapter upload daily at Novel Next. Net. His spear shot outward, releasing 6 streaks in quick succession. The wooden polearm bent and wove through the air like an elegant thread, matching the trajectory Lionel could see being projected onto the real world in real time. Clang! 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 The 2 swordsmen defended for their lives, their wings flapping hard as they were pushed back. An arrow flew between their head, aiming for Lionel's head before he could follow up. But, with just as much ease, Lionel tilted to the side, his spear tilting upward from a low trajectory, piercing toward the chin of one of the sparrows. Lionel's eyes suddenly widened, his blood rushing through his veins. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. That was it, that felt so good. He was washed with a feeling of euphoria even before his stinger blade shot through the lower jaw of the sparrow, exiting out the back of his skull. It was almost like Lionel had felt the success before it landed, like it was a perfect move the skies had blessed him with. It was a sort of emotion Lionel had never experienced before, and it left him on cloud 9. He pulled his spear back, his attacks suddenly becoming less predictable and more erratic. His rhythm shifted and moved like an elegant dance to music that jumped and warped. Sometimes it was fierce, at other times calm, and at yet other times it was ignited with a fiery passion that almost made Lionel's loins burn with the same heat. He could remember the seduction of the primitive woman, how scantily clad she was, how much grace and beauty she carried through with her every movement. Her pores oozed with charm, her steps fusing with her moving and leaving her enemies in a trance. It was suddenly so obvious to Lionel. How was it that the primitive woman could make a spear that could do nothing but pierce so powerful? It sounded quite ridiculous. Without any sort of variation, how could it be difficult to contend with her? But now, it was before Lionel as bright as day. There were many ways to vary one's attacks without using a different attack at all. You could change your cadence, your rhythm, you could even shift how much power you used, pushing and pulling at the instincts of an enemy until you lured them to a cliff and blew them a soft kiss as they fell off. Lionel's expression turned weird, breaking out of his trance. He shot a hand away from his spear, snatching at the air and grabbing an arrow out of the wind before it could pierce his brows. He laughed to himself, his laugh becoming louder and louder until the castle itself began to rock as the earth force that made up its foundation threatened to quake to the point the entire structure would come crumbling down. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel had immersed himself in the thoughts of the primitive woman to the point that he truly almost blew out a kiss mid-battle. Suddenly, Aina let out a whistle to his back. "Why did you stop? I was enjoying the show." Lionel looked back to find Aina's face red from laughter as severed corpses fell around her. She was wheezing to the point Lionel thought snot might fly from her nose at any moment now, yet she still somehow managed to remain gorgeous. "Show me more of what those swaying hips can do." Lionel's lip twitched. It seemed that he had immersed himself more than he thought. But soon, a sly grin spread across his face. "If you want to see what my hips can do, you only needed to ask." Sure. Aina laughed. "Do you want me to be top or bottom?" "Funny. Well, see if you're still laughing in the end or if you'll be looking at me with those puppy dog eyes again." Aina coughed through her laughter before jumping over the side of the castle wall. "You'll never get to see either of them if you can't keep up," she shouted out as she fell. Lionel flicked his wrist, sending the arrow he had caught through the brows of the pixie that had shot it at him before rushing after Aina. A smile was plastered all over his face. This was far more fun than he had had in a while. Since Aina had already seen him in such an embarrassing state, he might as well also show her the flexibility technique he learned from Valiant Heart Mountain. Even though he hadn't used it in a while, he thought it would be a useful way to get that smug smile on her face to turn into a lustful scream. Lionel's body flashed, a streak of gold being left in his wake, his spear's light severing everything in its path. Chapter 1431. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 1431. Familiar Senior. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. I uploaded this chapter hours ago but for some reason it didn't register. I guess I misclicked. Either that or WN glitched. Anywho, here you go. Lionel and Aina stood back to back in an elaborate throne room. Making it here wouldn't have been too difficult, if the construction of the castle hadn't been so conniving and vindictive. Describing the layout of an inanimate object like this might feel like a bridge too far, but if Lionel had the dictionary or wise star order to explain it to him, he would understand that the dwarven race had always been like this. Even if it wasn't for all the sinister traps and lurking dangers, the design of the castle alone would have been enough to drive the two of them crazy. The reality of the matter was that from the very beginning, the castle was designed for people half their size. Aina was just a bit over 6 feet tall herself, while Lionel was over 2 meters tall. The number of times they found themselves ducking or getting stuck in cramped locations was too much to count. Luckily, the throne room was a vast and wide hall. Unluckily, there were a swarm of protective knights and soldiers that would rather die than see Lionel and Aina kill their king and queen. That led to the current situation where the both of them were surrounded by swarms in the hundreds. Let alone to their fronts, backs and sides, they were even assaulted from above. In truth, this mission was designed for a team of 8 to take it on at the first or second tier of the 6th dimension. It was already quite ridiculous that the two of them had chosen to take it on. But that didn't stop the both of them from grinning ear to ear all the while, as the saying went, the couple that slays together, stays together. Lionel and Aina walked out of the portal side by side, a healthy sheen of sweat coating their bodies. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Visit N0 Velbin. Net. For the best novel reading experience. The senior manning the gate once again found himself stunned. But this time it wasn't due to Aina's beauty, but rather the time. The mission was meant to take a week for 6th dimensional existence. Though the senior was aware that Lionel and Aina were in the fifth dimension, it wasn't too rare for more talented quadrant-ranked disciples to take on lower-class galaxy-ranked missions. While it was true that most of them died as well, it wasn't this senior's job to try and save them. He didn't get paid nearly enough to deal with uppity geniuses who thought too much of themselves. Sometimes, though, these geniuses would manage to survive, if only barely, and he would give a slight nod of approval. However, even among that number, he would very rarely see them try again without an ample grace period. Something like this, though, where a pair went into an 8-person mission and came out completely unscathed outside of some heavy breathing. It was unheard of. Lionel smiled, reaching out a hand to get their mission plate back. Ah. Right. Yes. The senior handed over the plate, which had subtly changed in color. Such a thing would only happen after the mission was, indeed, completed. So now he was absolutely certain that there wasn't a mistake. He could only watch silently as the two walked away, his heart beating slightly faster than usual. The Void Palace was already a location where geniuses all came together from across the human domain. Even the youth at the lowest rung of his place was an overlord back at his home. To see two individuals who could even stand at the very top here. The senior glanced at his checkbook and made note of their names. In the future, this tidbit of information just might make him quite a bit of money in any one of their gambling dens. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel checked their gains and nodded to himself. That mission was among the harder one in the first galaxy rank, so their returns weren't bad. The two of them had made 70,000 void points. While that was only a few dozen percentage points better more than what Lionel had made with the spatial bristle rings, it was still a great sum. Lionel didn't expect to make a great amount, he just wanted enough so that he and Aina could finally switch out of their beast skin clothing. As great as his crafting was, because he had yet to learn how to counter anarchic force, there was only so long his force arts could last before degrading. Right now, the only reason their clothing hadn't fallen apart was because they made it was cursed beast fur to begin with. That aside, as great as it was staring at Aina's long legs and toned belly all day, he was starting to get tired of running into people whose eyeballs threatened to pop out of their skulls. Soon, Lionel and Aina had swapped into the galaxy-ranked uniforms of the Void Palace. The layered robes and deep violet-black colors made Lionel feel quite good. In addition, they were only 1,000 void points each since it was a mass-produced product. Plus, higher-level disciples rarely wore the uniform to begin with unless on official business representing the Void Palace, so there was no point in marking up prices. I can also exchange for robes of any rank I want because of my limbo state. Lionel smiled to himself, tucking it into the back of his mind. Following this, Lionel and Aina used the rest of their points to exchange for healing items. Both had insane healing factors, but they still chose to err on the side of caution. Lionel also insisted on buying Aina some flexible armor as well as her defenses were weaker than his own. With that completed along with a small rest, the two of them nodded toward one another and stepped toward a desolate region almost devoid of students. Up ahead, a singular senior stood, but this senior happened to be one that Lionel was almost too familiar with. His gaze narrowed, a slight killing intent manifesting around him in a subtle sheen of red. Aina blinked, taking note of the change. That was definitely not something Lionel had ever done before. When she saw who was ahead, though, she came to an understanding. It was none other than the envoy of the Void Palace, Orinik. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1432. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 17 seconds AM. Chapter 1432. Lucky star. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel had known for a very long time that Orinik was the one that had spread information about how he had gotten his amethyst token. In reality, Lionel didn't care much about this alone. After all, Orinik was telling the truth, he didn't spin a lie. Lionel had, indeed, used his connections to gain his token. However, the matters of back then were quite a bit more complex than others knew. While Miguel hadn't used the innate node during their battle, Lionel hadn't used his ability index. When Lionel's ability index was active, he could even defeat 6-dimensional existences while at tier 1 of the 5th dimension. Of course, those 6-dimensional existences couldn't possibly match up to the 6-dimensional existence of the Void Palace. But Miguel hadn't been in the 6th dimension back then either. On top of that, if Miguel had insisted on using his innate node, he would have lost even faster. Even back then, Lionel was already completely immune to the 4th-dimensional Scarlet Star Force Miguel had access to. And he was completely immune to destruction runes in general. This was all to say that if Lionel hadn't wanted to fight a thrilling battle, he could have made it very boring and left without suffering the injuries Orinik seemed to look down on him for suffering. While Lionel could admit that he would have still been lacking compared to the other true geniuses of the Void Palace back then, he had also never denied that. His problem with Orinik was the fact that his actions put Lionel's life and death in the line of fire, something he was well aware of. Lionel's life and death was one matter, but he also had the weight of the others on his shoulders during the first part of the true selection. If Lionel really hadn't had the strength of an amethyst token wielder back then not only would he have died, but their entire sector would have been wiped out, all because of this man before him. Lionel's steps didn't falter as he stepped forward. Orinik's gaze narrowed as well, but neither said a single word, at least not for the moment. When Lionel stepped before Orinik, he handed over his mission plate, causing Orinik's expression to change. Orinik had originally thought that Lionel had come here for revenge. It made sense, this place was quite secluded and disciples almost never came here. His job was more of a formality, another easy job he managed to land thanks to his connections. Everyone knew that this mission was practically suicide and higher-level disciples weren't allowed to go backward and complete void missions after promoting past their rank. The only exception to this rule was if a void mission had grown to the point that access to the resource would be lost without action. But, in those cases, the rewards usually tied to void missions were discontinued. However, Lionel needed this mission. Aina was right, rather than leaving things in the hands of others, they should go all out and leave no doubt. Complete void missions came with a special reward where one could request a rule break from the Senate. With the exception of a pardon for killing, you could pardon anything else. The only catch was that the person in need of a pardon had to clear a void mission of their rank and a pardon couldn't be used on behalf of another person. Depending on the star level of the void mission, you received a certain level of pardon. To void a contract, you needed a 3-star void mission, so this was the only choice. Obviously, Lionel wanted to help Aina clear this void mission so that they wouldn't have to fall into whatever schemes CO might or might not have concocted. After a few moments, Orinik, who had been ready to teach Lionel and Aina that there was still a large gap between levels of galaxy-ranked disciples, relaxed. So long as the two of them got themselves killed, he wouldn't even need to bother looking over his shoulder anymore. His lip curled. He didn't even ask any questions, nor did he try to talk them out of it like someone else might. Plus, even if he did, they were pretty much finished anyway. You couldn't retract a mission without having a 1-star pardon. And, if you failed a mission, you would end up doing manual labor until it was cleared. Considering this mission hadn't been cleared in over 1,000 years, they would be mining until they were old and gray. Orinik almost couldn't believe his luck. His problems were wrapping themselves in a neat little bow. It was beautiful. The portal whirred to life for the first time in a long time. Orinik's hands were practically a blur as he worked, as though he was scared that Lionel would change his mind. Lionel watched this coldly, not saying a single word and his expression not giving anything away as he thought of how he would deal with Orinik in the future. After a careless glance, he took Aina's hand and disappeared into the portal. When it closed, Orinik almost couldn't hold himself back from laughing. It was only after he managed to rein in his mad cackle that his mind began to spin. He had made it to his current level by biding his time, backstabbing when he should and retreating when he should. He had made quite a pretty penny selling out information about Lionel and making him public enemy number 1 during his true selection. Even if it wasn't Lionel, someone entering a 3-star void mission was already a money-making machine. The fact that it was the son of Velasco and the rising star Aina Brazinger who had entered made Orinik feel like he could practically print his own money. I can take advantage of this. This was the second reason he had pulled strings to net himself this job outside of its ease. There was money to be made. There should be a week until the portal told him they had failed. In that time, he had more than enough leeway to start a betting ring. With Aina's and the Morales names, the number of people who would join wasn't small at all. In fact, there might even be some sector-ranked disciples that joined. Aurinik almost rubbed his hands together. Lionel was his lucky star. He just had to milk this star before it inevitably died. Chapter 1433. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1433. Familiar scene. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina had no idea that they were being used by Aurinik once again. And, even if they did know, they wouldn't have the luxury of thinking too much about it because almost the instant they stepped through the portal, they found themselves being thrown into a bed of hot oil. Their first mission had placed them right in enemy territory, something that wasn't so bad considering the enemies they faced were still weak and manageable. However, when this void mission chose to do the very same thing, it was much less of a funny matter. Almost the instant Lionel and Aina appeared, they were surrounded by 5 six-dimensional members of the dwarven race, their strength layering down with an oppressive might. Just as wise Star Order had said, most races outside of humans had maximized their evolution down one path, and as such, they tended to share the same ability indexes, lineages factors, and overall strengths. The Raypaks were often born with explosive power and flexibility, the ability indexes falling in line to maximize their strengths. Pixies and sparrows, however, had extremely sharp eyes, high dexterity, agility, and speed. The first two helped greatly with their crafting and their traps. The latter two were exceptionally difficult to handle in battle. They tended to be excellent swordsmen and archers, not to mention assassins. The main reason that Lionel had chosen this 3-star void mission in particular was so that they could use their first mission to get used to the battle style of the pixies and sparrows. But the leap in skill and danger was so large that he felt he was naive to have thought it would be very helpful. P.S. If you guys don't read this on novel com and read somewhere else, I will hunt you and quill you. Well, retreat first, Lionel called out to Aina. Only step where I step, then well cut a path outward. Lionel's palm flipped over to reveal his stinger spear, his gaze flashing with a blaze of glory as he unleashed a barrage of piercing strikes. Almost instantly, the 2 archers of the ground reacted, each brandishing 2 arrows wrapped in vines. They communicated with their eyes seamlessly, releasing their bowstrings in a breath. Lionel's eyes glowed when he saw this scene. Despite the danger, he felt that these two had truly become one with their bows. When they inhaled, their bowstrings were pulled tight. When they exhaled, their attacks were released, following the trajectory of their gazes as though being controlled by nothing more than their wills. Beautiful, Lionel's spear force shattered apart beneath the twisted level 2 bow force. They tore apart the impurities and faults in his blade force as though it was nothing more than dried weed. Lionel took note of their target, taking a strong step forward and allowing light to envelop him. Right now wasn't the time for training, he had to go all out or else he and Aina would be buried here. Right this moment, they were stuck in a familiar forest with yet another castle built into the face of a mountain to their backs. It was clear that this was a staple of the dwarven race. But this one was far more elaborate than the last, and the powerhouses protecting this one were on a completely different level. This wasn't something that Lionel and Aina could just barge their way through. They needed to plan, scope out the situation, get a lay of the land, and approach with purpose. Lionel's pupils dilated, his pale violet irises waking up. They shimmering like 2 purple torches in the darkness as Lionel's canines grew. Bang! Lionel exploded forward, his speed completely unlike what it had been before. The 2 archers didn't even get the chance to pull their bowstrings again before their throats were pierced through. Lionel blazed a trail by them, Aina enveloping herself in a cloak of red as she shot ahead as well, the heads of 3 swordsmen flying. Lionel didn't even look back as 5 orbs of scarlet star force forms and enveloped their bodies and blood before they could even touch the ground. He knew that this wasn't a video game. He had to make sure that he and Aina left no traces behind to give their enemies the least amount of time to prepare. Their ashes scattered into the wind as the two disappeared over the horizon. Mere seconds later, another squad of pixies and sparrows appeared, only to furrow their brows when they found nothing at all. They could have sworn that there was a commotion here, but now there was absolutely nothing. What was going on, exactly? It would be several hours before they realized that an entire scouting unit had vanished. But, by then, Lionel and Aina would be long gone. Lionel exhaled a breath, landing on a thin branch. Not long afterward, Aina landed on a tree across from him, putting her axe away to stop it from snapping in two. At the moment, her brows were a bit furrowed. She realized that this would be difficult. If they didn't have a time limit, they could just take their time. But they only had a week or this would be considered a failure. The good news was that in a controlled zone like this one, failing just meant they would be ejected. The bad news was that failure also meant manual labor, not to mention a heavy monetary penalty. Lionel suddenly laughed. Worried about failing? A bit. Don't worry about it, Aina's brows rose as she listened to Lionel's explanation. Eventually, she started laughing too, her body becoming far more relaxed. She believed in them as a pair, but something about the looming potential punishment still made her feel suffocated. Now knowing it didn't matter if they failed, she was far more relaxed and composed. She still had the weight of her mother's revenge on her shoulders and she also cared about Lionel achieving his goals as well. Something like being stuck doing menial labor for hundreds of years wasn't something she could accept, she would rather fall out with the Void Palace and kill herself a path out. So what do we do first? First, I'll do some scouting. Stay here, I'll be back within an hour. After that, it'll be the same as usual. The couple grinned at each other, seemingly liking the scent of blood a bit too much. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1434. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1434. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel flashed through the trees. He kept his light force restrained as much as possible. The atmosphere was a huge help to him, there was no reason for him to ruin it for himself. In the past, he had hated the atmosphere of the Void Palace. But right now, the perpetual darkness, the heavy fog, and the restrained internal sight was a huge benefit to his stealth right this moment. Instead of projecting it, Lionel allowed this new light force to circulate through his nodes. It felt weird no longer having snow force within him. But the unique light force of the starry-tailed fox was so far beyond it that he was sure he would get used to it very quickly. Not only did this light force boost his speed for more than snow force ever did, its passive healing was unlike anything Lionel had ever experienced before, and it was also certain that its potency in battle was on a completely different level as well. Lionel could see images of a majestic illusory fox with 3 long spiritual tails, sweeping out a claw that collapsed solar systems. The blades of light traveled through even space itself, tearing apart everything in its path. This unique light force practically spoke its name into his mind. Ethereal Star Force. In that moment, Lionel understood just what kind of weight this force held. His starry spirit domain, powered by ethereal star force, made him immune to internal sight on his level. That meant that only someone with 7th-dimensional internal sight, or 6th-dimensional internal sight stronger than his own, could detect him. Grasping this truth, Lionel became more confident in his scouting mission. Though this ability wasn't as strong as the Raypack's immunity, it wasn't far. So long as he stayed out of sight, he would be fine. He understood now that ethereal star force wasn't just a light and star force mixture. It was also a space force mixture. It was just unfortunate that his dimension was too weak to make use of its spatial properties just yet, but this much was enough for now. Soon, the castle appeared before Lionel. As expected, he appeared as its further right edge where the scouting units were the thinnest. He closed his eyes and unfurled his internal sight. Another benefit of the wisdom spirit branch was that his internal sight had also become far more difficult to detect as well, so he didn't hold back in the slightest. If he really ran into someone with stronger internal sight than his own, he would simply directly give up. Such an existence wasn't something that he and Aina would be able to beat. He would then use his loophole to avoid punishment. The senses of the dwarven race seemed to be very good, something Lionel had experienced during both missions already. So, it wasn't absolutely impossible for him to run into such an individual. Luckily, even after sweeping through the whole castle, Lionel didn't find such a person. However, his expression didn't relax in the slightest. This castle is far more elaborate. Even with my internal sight improving to hundreds of meters under the influence of anarchic force, I still can't see the whole layout. It's also far deeper underground than the last one was as well, and the traps, the ones I can detect, anyway, are also far more elaborate. I'll need to move to 3 more locations to get the full scope. Lionel finished his calculations quickly, deducing how many more spots he needed to visit to get the full layout. Then, he moved. In order to complete this mission, they need to crush the power structure of this base. That meant they needed to kill all 8 generals, all 4 dukes, and both the king and queen. Obviously, though, the situation was more complex than that since each of them was heavily protected. From what Lionel saw, they wouldn't need to enter the castle to deal with the 8 generals. But the 4 dukes and the king and queen were all located within the castle. The upper half of the castle was split into the north, south, east and west directions. These were controlled by the dukes. The underground layout was far more elaborate and far more protected. That region was the location of the king and queen. In dwarven culture, darkness and being closer to the earth was seen as noble, something that was ironic considering they tended to fly in the air in battle. Either way, knowing this, it made sense why the king and queen would be so far underground. It might be smarter to tackle the king and queen first. Once they're dead, the dukes will begin fighting over power, simultaneously splitting the generals as well. This was the conclusion Lionel came to after finishing his scouting. From a cursory glance, the north, south, east and west duke had a bit of a rivalry going on. If he poked at this, he could benefit them. From the very beginning, Lionel's approach was far different from others. Most took out the generals first, then the dukes, before targeting the monarchy if they even got that far to begin with. But Lionel hadn't even considered doing this for more than a moment. Like a madman, he chose to complete the hardest task first. When he returned to Aina and explained his plans, she agreed immediately. When it came to such plans, she would always leave it up to Lionel. Her only issues arose when he didn't explain himself. But with things like this, she was fully on board. Alright, give me some time. If we're going to do this, I can't go in without a bow. You should just steal one, Aina suggested. They're too small, Lionel shook his head. After using a longbow, I can't imagine going back. The white lion bow was 3 meters tall, even his bronze-grade black bow was that tall. But the bows of the dwarven race were half that size often. He would have to carve his own. But how would he craft without little Tali? Lionel didn't regret using their void points on Aina's armor instead of a bow for him. Now, though, he needed to find a solution. He exhaled a breath. It seemed he would have to improvise. As Lionel and Aina were preparing for their raid, a small commotion had already begun to buzz in the Void Palace's galaxy region as Orynyx advertising began to spread like wildfire. Chapter 1435. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1435. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What did you say? Vega furrowed her brows. The current situation was completely unlike what one would expect from such a powerful disciple. Vega wasn't in the middle of some hard training, nor was she practically a technique or cultivating her strength. Instead, she stood behind an enormous desk. Despite the fact she was standing on her feet, the number of documents she was rifling through was still enough to obscure her face. The subordinate that was reporting to her right now had to talk through a wall of this stacked paper, or else they would never be able to get access to their faction leader. In truth, the documents here were worse than they usually were. But, because Vega had wasted so much time with Aina, they had built up. Now she was paying for it. Such a thing only made her more infuriated with Sio for butting into her matters. But, that little weasel had vanished and she couldn't find him. We've been keeping an eye on young Aina's movements. She spent most of her time in the hospital, but a few hours ago she entered a Senate branch and accepted a mission. But, she returned not long later and accepted another one. We weren't able to learn what these missions were, but she completed the first one smoothly. It was a mission that should have taken a week, but she completed it in just about 6 or so hours. What level? Level 1 Gala, not a big deal, move on. Vega didn't look up as she continued to rifle through the documents before her. Others might have used pendants to accomplish this task, but she didn't like the vulnerable state it put her in. The Void Palace was dangerous, especially for faction leaders and even more especially for beautiful women. She always had to be in top condition to handle every and anything. So, she was the type to refuse to leave herself vulnerable, even to the point of doing things like this. The main issue, faction head, is that she's now entered a 3-star void mission. Vega's hands froze. What? She's entered a 3-star void mission and a galaxy-ranked disciple has begun to take bets on her odds of coming out. The reporter seemed to completely ignore Lionel's presence. But, this wasn't due to any disdain on her part, it was rather because she understood the personality of Vega well and didn't want to step on her toes. After what happened with Sio, Vega was especially sensitive to women. She had taken a fancy to being love-struck fools at the beck and call of men. Of course, fancy in this context was for their power. As much as she seemed to dislike men, Vega was, in fact, straight. In truth, it wasn't even that Vega disliked men. She just found things easier to deal with if she lorded over just a single gender. But, everyone had emotions, so she had been soft when it came to managing relationships. Unfortunately, it was coming back to bite her now. So, she was wondering if she should change her approach. The trouble with doing that was that she also understood how the hearts of people worked. If these were the rules from the very beginning, it would be fine. But, taking away a right after having already given it was a recipe for disaster. If things were handled incorrectly, the faction she had labored decades over would collapse. Hearing what Aina had done for just her second mission, though, Vega's expression couldn't help but darken. She had, obviously, not given up on Aina yet. But, she needed a method to bring Aina in. If Aina died, though, it would obviously all be for naught. Vega's expression flickered. Maybe this is an opportunity. Move some funds around in the third vault. Bet 10. No, that's too much for a bet. That'll be mostly galaxy-ranked disciples. In that case, use Vault 5. Bet 1,000,000 void points on their failure. But faction head, she's with, you mean Lionel Morales? His climbing of the tower was weird, but I have a feeling that it was more related to Dream Force than anything else. I sensed the concentration being exceptionally high. If Lionel knew that Vega had drawn a conclusion similar to the Void Elders, it was difficult to tell how he would react. Vega's thoughts were clearly far more vague and even quite off base, but the fact she realized that she had been affected by Dream Force at all spoke volumes. I'm aware of these things already. But, the only 3-star void mission they could enter should be the Goblin Castle mission. I have some inside information on that mission, they'll definitely fail. But if she dies, there's about a 20% chance she comes out alive. In that case, she'll need my help to get out of manual labor and the penalty. By then, she won't be able to escape my grasp even if she wants to. Vega's grasp of the rules was deep, but it was clearly not as deep as Lionel's. Even if she dies, we'll make back my investment in wasting so many days on her and we'll move forward with the original timeline of things. Yes, faction head. Oh, and keep my bet anonymous. Vega's irises flashed as her hands began to move again. She would cover all her bases. In the slim likelihood they really succeeded, she wouldn't offend Aina any more than she already had. Interesting. So the little girl who cut my void merit pool down by so much is seeking her death? I've heard some inside information on that zone. They plan to send some sector disciples in to deal with it within the century. It's already that close to beyond what galaxy-ranked disciples could handle. At the very least, if she dies like this, it'll regain my spot on the current leaderboards. Triana shook her head, seemingly not satisfied with this. Bet the last year's supply of void merits on their failure. Triana clearly didn't care as much about remaining low profile like Vega did. In fact, when she learned that Lionel was also with Aina, she doubled her bid again. Chapter 1436. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1436. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina had no idea what was going on, nor did they know that their choice had stirred up such a commotion. Lionel jumped from tree to tree, knocking on their wood as he tried to find exactly the kind he was looking for. There was something odd about trees that survived the density of anarchic force. They all looked the same. Lionel assumed they had undergone a convergent evolutionary path, following the same methods to combat their environment. That said, their interiors were very different. There were two ways to tell. The first was by observing the shape of their leaves, and the second was Lionel's method. Lionel didn't know much about plants, herbs, and the like. But he could recognize his material needs when he found them. By knocking on the wood, he could make out practically all of its uses and whether it was suitable for certain crafts or not. The foundational knowledge his father had left him with was more than enough to extrapolate to a whole range of situations. And his wood carving lessons came with an added help benefit right now. Lionel was looking for a wood which was rigid enough to maintain its form while also being flexible enough to take his strength without snapping. Lionel came to a grinding halt, the branch beneath him swaying. He jumped, landing on the very same branch again and forcing it to bend. Lionel bent it so far that he slipped back down to the ground. But the branch itself snapped back up, whipping back and forth with so much forward that a whistling sound lashed out through the wind. Perfect. Lionel pressed his fore and middle finger together, a long strand of spear force manifesting and beginning to slowly tremble. Lionel's eyes narrowed as he watched this. He didn't normally use spear force like this. It lacked the flexibility of form bow force did. But that was also exactly why he did this. He knew that there was something about spear force that he was missing, and he wanted to understand it better. With it in the range of his starry spirit domain like this, he could feel it much more clearly than he ever had before. The comprehension he had used to build this level 2 spear force felt so empty. Range was the word he had used, but it felt so odd to think like that when the spear could never match something like the bow in range. Still, Lionel felt that his comprehension was correct. It was just incomplete. There was something beyond range. Lionel's finger trembled, causing motes of scarlet star force to fuse with his trembling spear force and turning its golden hues into a deathly golden crimson. He swiped across with a deft speed, slicing the top half of the tree off and then repeating it with the bottom. In the end, a thick log about 3.5 meters tall stood, stripped of its bark to reveal a silvery sort of wood. This wood should be powerful enough without force arts. I wouldn't have a force quill to draw them anyway. In that case, Lionel smiled, an excited gleam lighting in his eyes as his design for his bow began to manifest in the real world. A pale blue construct took form, completely transparent. However, that was when things began to change. A perfect replica of the wood Lionel was working with appeared in his mind. He reconstructed it down to a chemical level, understanding its in and outs as though it was the back of his own hand. Then, the pale blue construct began to change. It slowly became real in form, losing its pale blue color and becoming almost solid. Let's try a sixth-dimensional cursed beast tendon. With a thought, a bowstring appeared on it. Lionel's finger grasped the string, pulling it back. With another thought, an arrow also appeared, nocked perfectly. Lionel's back strained, his muscles tensed. Interesting, I can only pull it out to about 70% even without additional force arts. Let's see how it reacts to destruction runes. Lionel tried out many things. When he finished his tests, he grinned. Testing things with his real body felt so different. The construct of his mind obviously wasn't tangible. The reason Lionel could feel the bowstring and feel strain was because he was using his Tier 4 control to simulate it all. By fusing all of this information together, he could gain a perfect replica of how a craft would act and react in the real world and control the reactions of his body so that it reacted as though his illusions were tangible. In fact, with this new ability, Lionel could even form a sparring partner that could make him feel as though he was really being punched and harmed. Now that he thought about it, it was like he could take the simulation ability of the Void Tower with him everywhere. This would change Lionel's crafting ability forever. He already felt he made a breakthrough after his quill self-destructed, but this was another massive leap forward. When he finally got little Tolly back, his skill would be on a whole other level. Lionel snapped his fingers, causing the bowstring and arrow to disappear. With very deft control, he covered his bow construct in ethereal star force. Once he was finished, he slid the construct into the center of the log of wood. Lionel hopped down from the log, placing his hand on its body. His hair fluttered. Closing his eyes, a smile curling his lips. He should be able to do this in one go. Lionel's eyes flashed open, an avalanche of destruction runes forming in irises. Bang! The log exploded into a rain of ash. With a swift hand, Lionel snatched forward, snagging the surviving bough out of the air. His grin widened. It was perfect down to the smallest deviation, its silvery glow dancing in his hand. Lionel dispelled the ethereal star force that had protected it, feeling the nice heft on his palm. This was a game changer. Time to slaughter some goblins. Chapter 1437. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1437. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. When night fell in the Void Palace, it just made the blacks blacker. It was already difficult to see ahead of you in the day, but the darkness of night made it impossible to even see your hand before your face. This wasn't normally a problem during the modern day because the Void Elders had set up formations that allowed a perpetual dull light. Though it didn't help with the fog, it made the transition from night to day almost impossible to track. However, in a zone like this one, back before the humans had reclaimed their territory, there was no such luxury. But that also left things in the perfect state for Lionel and Aina. It made them even more difficult to detect in the darkness. Aina was surprisingly quite able to navigate in the darkness, but Lionel didn't ask about it. He assumed that it was related to her life force affinity. Unlike other forces, almost everything had life force. And the things that didn't really stand out by virtue of that fact alone. Using this sort of perspective, it wasn't hard to imagine how someone with life force could parse apart their surroundings without their eyes. No longer worried about Aina, Lionel shot forward at a faster speed, weaving through the trees. Aina followed to his back, their steps in perfect sync. Lionel knew that they still had to be careful even in this environment. Because of their culture, the dwarven race was very well adapted to seeing in dim and no-light situations. While Lionel couldn't even see his hand without activating his lineage factor's eyes, they could probably see just fine, albeit worse than they would otherwise be able to do in the day. But he had already taken this into consideration the moment he saw that the castle's lighting situation was less than optimal. Soon, he and Aina made it to the last line of trees. Without a spatial ring to use, Lionel could only strap his bow to his back along with his arrows. He didn't make much of the latter, though. With so many dwarven bowmen around, he would have more of his fair share of arrows to steal. With a thought, Lionel and Aina's internal sights linked as one. This time, the two of them were ready for the level of intimacy required and didn't flinch as they had before. They had nothing to hide from one another, so the process was even smoother. Their tandem was already seamless in the past. But now, they didn't need to waste energy calculating and using their instincts to understand the other's actions. The moment the connection was established, they bolted forward, practically cutting a line through the earth with their speed. Lionel had timed it perfectly, picking a blind spot and appearing at the base of the castle in the blink of an eye. After a moment of lamenting the fact he couldn't use his earth force to dig through the ground here before leaping up and over the wall, Lionel and Aina didn't spend even more than a fraction of a second atop the wall before falling down lightly on the other side. Shrouded in darkness, they bolted forward, slipping not the gate furthest to the right. Much like medieval castles, the castles of the dwarven race were far more city than home. Beyond the walls Lionel and Aina had just fallen from, there were 5 gates or doorways. These 5 gates were actually the starting point of grand tunnels dug into the face of the mountain. After slipping through them, Lionel and Aina were greeted by an enormous tunnel followed by yet another wall. This wall was the start of an underground city. However, they ignored it entirely, slipping around to the back of the tunnel and slipping into one of the many mining tunnels that dotted the landscape around them. The dwarven race liked to use the terrain when they were building their settlements, but a robust landscape for their safety was only one consideration. The second was resources. Precious metals and anything that could help their crafts was exactly what the dwarven race wanted. Any pixie or sparrow that wasn't a combat specialist or a crafter was likely a miner. But this didn't come with the same negative connotations it did in the human race. In fact, they took great pride in their strengths. Usually, these mining tunnels wouldn't lead to much of anywhere. But during his scouting, Lionel found that some of these passageways doubled as escape routes and bunkers. Many of them led to dead ends where stockpiles of food and water would be kept, but if you chose correctly, trap ahead. Lionel spoke to Aina before accelerating once again. The two of them reached one of the so-called dead ends, but Lionel had already slammed a palm forward. His momentum was swift and fiery, but just before he hit the wall, his hand slipped right through. What a clever mechanism, Lionel thought as he slipped right through. The wall was designed to pick up on intention, but the way it did so was quite ingenious. It calculated your speed and acceleration along with your distance from the wall. The moment you crossed a threshold the trap deemed impossible to stop from, it would deactivate. If your speed was beneath a certain threshold, it would feel like hitting a wall. However, if you had crossed a certain speed and hesitated at the end, the trap would put an arrow right between your brows. Lionel had to admit that there was a lot to learn from the dwarven race. Although their force arts were crude, even cruder than what Lionel had seen from the human race, their applications of them were intelligent, crafty and quite economical. They did a lot with a little and their minds worked in wondrous ways. The moment Lionel and Aina passed through this trap, Lionel was certain that there wouldn't be any pixies or sparrows ahead. This was a tunnel reserved for emergency situations and could only be used by the nobles, their families, and their royal guards. However, on the other side, there'd be a battle that was unavoidable and would place them right at the heart of dwarven territory. Chapter 1438. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1438. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. There was nothing to hesitate about. Lionel and Aina had already secured their escape route by choosing this path. The moment they approached the exit, Aina gathered up another burst of acceleration, blazing a trail right by Lionel. Lionel's lip curled into a smile. With a single movement of both arms, he brandished his bow and nocked an arrow. The smooth feeling of beast fur tickled his palm as he wrapped around its center tightly, the beast tendon bowstring wafting a deathly black fog. Lionel's smile vanished in the blink of an eye, his gaze becoming cold and calculating. His vision went blank for a moment. But, when it cleared once more, he found himself deep with what looked like catacombs. The pillars that surrounded the region were carved directly out of the ground, connecting with the ceiling. It made it feel like the entire place was carved out in one piece, creating a beautiful, albeit somber, sort of ambience. This was a location of reflection and silence for the older members of the pixie and sparrow race. But due to the fact this was a unique zone held open for so long, much of the logical progression of things had become twisted and tainted. So, not only were there no children to be found around, there weren't any members of the older generation either. Regardless, Lionel wasn't aware of these things. His main focus was Aina up ahead, who had already crossed the halfway mark. With a single powerful leap, Lionel shot into the air and crossed a distance of over 20 meters. He pulled his bowstring back, his gaze calm and unhurried. He seemed to sink into a rhythm, one not much different from the six-dimensional pixie they had faced when they first landed on this world. His bow became an extension of himself, time itself almost seeming to slow. Then, he released with an exhale. Not good enough. Though he thought these words, his arrow flew true, piercing through the head of the right sparrow just as Aina's axe sliced the left sparrow in half. Lionel landed on the ground, a blinding trail of gold appearing to his back as he finally unleashed his ethereal star force. As though a bird being released from his cage, he felt free. If not for the stuffy air so far beneath ground, it would almost feel like he was galloping through the skies. He caught up with Aina in a blink as the two let their presences be known. This location was within the most sacred region of the king and queen's stronghold. It was located right to the back of the throne room, and it was adjacent to the king and queen's chamber. If the king and queen were in the throne room, it would just be a straight shot to their heads. However, if the king and queen were in their chambers, they would have to follow a U-like path. If the king and queen were in neither, they would have to continue past the throne room in a straight line toward the dining, dance hall, and other like regions. Lionel, though, was already well aware that the king and queen were in the throne room. Despite it being the dead of night, higher dimensional beings didn't function like normal humans did. In addition, third-dimensional pixies and sparrows were nocturnal to begin with. So, the moment Aina burst into the throne room, crashing through their doors, all the nobles of the dwarven race were alerted immediately. Lionel's gaze flashed, taking everything in with no more than a single glance. The thrones seating the king and queen were to the far wall, a distance of at least 100 to 150 meters separating them from him and Aina. Large swaths of nobles lined the sides in their seats, similar to what one might expect from a senate or congress. Before them, royal guards took the stairs and the railways to maintain order, with the most powerful of them standing near and around the king and queen. Lionel took a breath, his gaze becoming colder on his exhale. This was the trouble of this zone. Due to an oddity, the king and queen, along with the nobles, were in a perpetual meeting. In real life, this wouldn't make any sense. But matters like this could easily happen as the unique zone became more twisted. The only nobles not present here were the dukes. One would think that if you killed the dukes, then the nobles would be forced to make a move. But, if you did that, what would actually happen is that the duke's noble guards would also join the meeting, making the task even harder. Lionel wasn't aware of this prior, but he made a simple observation. He noticed that the throne room was packed to the brim, and yet the dukes weren't present. How could the king and queen hold a meeting like this without their highest nobles being here? That was when Lionel realized that there was something wrong with this zone. If he wanted to defeat it, he would have to take an unconventional approach. And the result of that was taking on this suicide mission right here and right now. The strongest people here were the king and queen, both of whom were at tier 4 of the 6th dimensional. The royal guards were all tier 3. The noble pixies and sparrows were all either tier 1 or 2. Their total over 300 noble pixies and sparrows, 36 royal guards, and 2 monarchs. It was no wonder this was practically a death trap. Lionel, though, wondered how far he could push this oddity in the zone. The mission only stated that they had to collapse the structure of power. Kill the king, queen, dukes, and generals. So, if they killed the king and queen before escaping, would the nobles and royal guards still be stuck here? A boundless pressure wafted from him, his canines growing and the illusion of 3 tails that towered dozens of meters appearing to his back. Let's do this. Aina responded with a roar, her foot stomping down hard as a pillar of crimson shot through the ceiling. Chapter 1439. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1439. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's eyes sharpened, his pale violet hair becoming a bright white before lengthening to the point it waved out to his back like a river of light. His sideburns grew with the same blinding white, his canines continuing to grow to the point that they were almost double the length of any of his other teeth. His pale violet eyes flashed with a white gold light, his dilated pupils growing even larger. His field of view became monstrous. A normal human, even at higher dimensions, would only have a focused view of about 5 degrees and a sharp view about 30 degrees. But Lionel's had grown to 90 degrees. At the same time, his peripheral vision had increased from just about 200 degrees to just over 330, with only the remaining 30 degrees centralized to the back of his head. Nothing could escape Lionel's vision. It was as though the entire world had opened up to him. Aina charged forward and he wasn't far behind. He only had 10 arrows with him, but they were more than enough to start this off with a bang. He knocked 2 arrows as Aina charged forward, his eyes glowing with such a radiant light that his dilated pupils could no longer be seen. It was almost as though his eyes had been replaced by 2 dancing white gold flames that licked against his eyelashes and brows. In that moment, Lionel released his arrows. They twirled through the air as though they had minds of their own, whizzing by Aina's ears and appearing before the throats of 2 royal guards that had already stood in her way to stop her. The expressions of the 2 sparrow guards changed, brandishing their short spears to block. However, this decision was the worst one to make. The moment they moved to block, Aina's foot smashed against the ground. What had already seemed to be her greatest speed doubled, the air around her front collapsing like a clap of thunder as she appeared before the 2 guards. A towering blade force surged. Lionel thought it felt like a sword at first, and then it felt like a spear, and then a rod, before it finally settled into the form of an axe, shattering past a barrier and sparkling with the grace of a level 3 blade force. 6th dimensional battle axe force. 2 heads soared into the air, spurts of blood following their arc through the air. Lionel's arrows had long since ricocheted off of their short spears. His pupils flickered within the dense gold they hid behind, reading trajectories as a cascade of numbers flooded his senses. Even as his eyes bounced back and forth, and Aina charged forward, his free hand had already reached for his arrow, pulling out 3 and sliding each one between his fingers. He watched as his first 2-shot arrows spun wildly in the air, having been knocked off to the side. From all sides, noble guards surged toward Aina, while only a few along with some more fearless nobles charged for Lionel. But he didn't seem to see them at all. His eyes focused on the spinning arrows through the air. They rotated with speed that could put anyone in the 5th dimension to shame, and yet to Lionel, they flowed oh so slowly. Lionel knocked 3 arrows, their tips blazing with level 2 bow force as he exhaled, a golden breath leaving his lips as though the skies themselves were sighing as the elegance of his shot. The 3 arrows shot through the air, curving past the heads of several guards and appeared before their targets in the blink of an eye. The leftmost arrow caught up with Lionel's spinning arrow. In Lionel's eyes, the event couldn't have been slower. Both arrows rushed by one another, completely perpendicular. However, just as the blazing arrow passed by the spinning arrow not by more than a hair's breadth, a portion of Lionel's bow force influenced it. As though being given new life, the spinning arrow shook in the air, its spinning momentum along its length becoming concentrated into a spiral along its width. The arrow became like a drill bit. Catching a royal guard off guard, it shot through the pixie's head, sending her flying to the side only for her corpse to be pinned to an opposite wall. The scene replayed itself on the right side. But, this time, both arrows applied pressure on the rotating arrow, causing it to pass through the heads of not just 1 royal guard, but 2. Lionel's 3-shot arrows continued blazing a trail forward, their trajectories suddenly shifting drastically to aim for the head of the king as though this was the main goal all along. The sudden change caught the royal guard off guard, but they were still ready. They dove before the 2 thrones, brandishing their weapons and their force as they rose into the air, their wings flapping and rising them into the air. Unfortunately, but now, Aina had gained the blood of not just 1, but 5 separate royal guards. The crimson blood, tinged with a hint of violet, danced behind her. Her steps came to a heavy stop, the soles of her shoes gliding along the polished marble floor of the throne room as she pulled her axe back, her back flexing and her polearm bending beneath the might of her gathering momentum. The 5 globules of blood gathered, coating her blade and blazing with life. Fueled with the vitality of 5 six-dimensional powerhouses, the power was unprecedented. Even further fueled by her 6-dimensional battle axe force, and it was like her attack was given the wings of an angel as it shot forward. The scythe of crimson shot forward like a wave, cutting down everything in its path and even bisecting some nobles scrambling to the side. The solemn expression of the royal guards couldn't change anything. Their weapons were torn in two, their bodies being sent flying backward. However, it was right at that moment that the king and queen stomped their feet, countless patterns along the wall and ground springing to life. Chapter 1440. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1440. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. A transparent and golden barrier shot up, connecting the floor and ceiling along with protecting the king and queen behind a seemingly unbreakable shield. The roar of a dragon sounded as an eastern version of the beast swirling about the barrier, tangling itself with other magnificent creatures of legends. Just with a glance, Lionel could see phoenixes, winged tigers, behemoths, centaurs, western dragons, unicorns, mermaids. The number felt endless and they all roared in unison. Even as the corpses of the royal guard splashed against the barrier, their blood incinerated to ash and wafted into the air. Bang! Aina's blood scythe crashed into the barrier, but it barely rippled. It only took a single glance to tell how powerful this barrier was. Let alone killing the king and queen in their state, it would take a powerful individual of the quasi-7th dimension to even think of shaking it. The dwarven race weren't known for their combat prowess, but it was clear that this barrier was set up with the most powerful races of the dimensional verse in mind. It would definitely take a genius of the sector rank to shatter the barrier. This was how the dwarven race closed the gap with other races. They focused on speed and evasion. Their senses were better than most and their bowmanship was especially profound. But their greatest reliance were their traps. This trap, though, was far more profound than anything Lionel had seen them use up to this point. If their previous force arts could be considered crude, this was on a level all to its own. It was either the dwarven race had invited another race to draw it for them, something that was highly unlikely. Or, much like their usual scheming demeanors, they had lulled Lionel into a false sense of security with their crude force arts, only to show their true strength when it really mattered. This force art formation was hidden beneath 7th-dimensional materials. It was no wonder he hadn't detected it before. Lionel's pupils flickered. How clever. He and Aina were separated by over 100 meters now and a swarm of royal guards were charging after the both of them, separating them further. On top of that, he had a feeling that the barrier wasn't finished just yet. Just as Lionel thought this, statues that lined the top of the throne room began to shake themselves awake. The spirits of the beasts stuck in the barrier swam out, diving through the marbled ground, up the walls, and fusing into the statues before roaring to life. The mythical beasts were instantly completely indistinguishable from the real thing, their stone bodies nowhere to be seen, replaced by scales, fur, and rough skin that gave off a brimming vitality. The beasts roared, their heads cocking back and before snapping forward to release beams of light that shot for Lionel and Aina. Lionel's figure flashed, appearing before the royal guards that were trying to close in on him in an instant. His plan was obvious. These beams wouldn't dare to continue hitting him if they were just harming their own kind. But, to Lionel's shock, the beams cut right through the bodies of the pixies and sparrows, not harming a hair on their heads before appearing before his chest in the blink of an eye. Lionel's eyes bulged, sending this information to Aina instantly before a roar left his lips. He spun to the spin, narrowly avoiding the beam. But, a trail of scorched skin was left on his chest as a line was ripped through his void palace uniform. Lionel's gaze became cold, his skin blazing to life with bronze runes that peeked through the hole in his robes. The wound on his chest healed quickly, but it was still far slower than he had expected for his current healing factor. Bang! The doors to the throne room slammed close as the previously cowering nobles began to swarm Lionel and Aina. It was only then Lionel realized that even their previous fear and cowardice was all an act. They wanted to trap Lionel and Aina, to push them to the point they would have difficulty escaping any longer. Suddenly, the enemies the couple had to face increased by 100-fold. Lionel's eyes flashed, his steps light and quick as he weaved through several attacks, beams of light continuously attacking him from above. Sliding his bow onto his back again, Lionel's palm flipped over to reveal his spear. Clang! 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 He was forced several steps back, the room he had to maneuver becoming smaller and smaller. Lionel's brow furrowed. He needed to find the flaw of this formation, but all of this commotion was making it difficult. His internal sight was being interfered with, and he was certain that it was another trick of the dwarven race. His starry spirit domain was just fine, but even with his tails deployed, its maximum range was only 5 meters. If he wanted to scan this entire room, he would need to do it piece by piece. But, with its size, Lionel's gaze became frighteningly cold. In the Void Palace, a day had already passed and the bets were only growing. Orinik couldn't help but grin ear to ear. He didn't even need to bet, he just needed to take a small percentage and he would be drowning in more void points than he would know how to spend. Originally, he had thought that he would only have lower-level galaxy-ranked disciples participating, but after news of Triana's wild bid was spread, strategically by him, of course, the heat for these events ramped up far more than even tenfold could account for. By this point, some factions had even begun sending their scouts to linger around the zone, making a once-dead region far livelier than it had been in a very long time. In another part of the Void Palace, Amory opened and closed his hand, checking how well it had healed. At that moment, a servant knocked and entered, relaying information about the commotion to the sword deity. Chapter 1441. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1441. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Oh, it seems that your rival is acting just as wildly as usual. An old man chuckled after hearing the news. He leaned back in his chair, taking a swig of alcohol and seemingly uncaring about Amory's feelings on the topic. He was quite sloppy for a man of his stature, but he didn't seem to care about that either. Rival? Amory said lightly. The old man's gaze flashed with a hint of coldness that was completely different from his usual demeanor. What did I say about excuses? The coldness in the man's words seemed to cause the temperature to drop by several degrees. However, Amory was unmoved. He continued to squeeze and open his hand, wanting to make sure that everything was perfect. He didn't plan on picking up a sword with this hand again until it was absolutely health. To a swordsman, the hands were far too important. He would rather only use a single hand until these lingering issues were gone than to risk aggravating it again. Hands were among one of the most difficult non-lethal injuries to heal. There were so many bones, so many fragile ligaments, and so many potential variables. Amory refused to take any risks with his future. He was the man who would stand atop the human race and repel their enemies with a single sword. He wouldn't do anything that compromised that. When did I make any excuses? Amory replied. I only questioned your choice of words. I don't see him as a rival. That is all. The old man leaned back into his chair, the coldness dissipating as he took another swig. After Amory finished saying this, he rose up. I will be back for more treatment tomorrow. My hand is still not ready. With that, he turned and left. What an annoying brat. The old man chuckled. In truth, he knew the truth. Right now, most of Amory's sword force was directed towards suppressing the tribulation of sword domain. It wasn't even a tenth as powerful as it was usually. In addition, during his battle with Lionel, he had refrained from using his lineage factor as it sometimes impacted his psyche. If he lost control of himself in battle and used more of his sword force than he should and the tribulation was released, it would be too late for regret. Amory felt no need to fear Lionel at his full strength even if the latter had that bow. But, he knew that if Lionel hadn't had that bow, the victor of their battle would have been him. Knowing this, how could Amory see Lionel as a rival? At most, he was just annoyed he lost to someone he saw as inferior to himself, and that was a loss he would remember. He would use it to fuel him so that he could make sure that such a thing never happened to him again. As for challenging Lionel again to clear himself of humiliation, he didn't care to do it. As far as he was concerned, it was nothing more than a waste of his time. You know that he never even wanted the Shadow Sovereign Ability Index to begin with. A second voice, this one clearly feminine, rang through the room. He's stubborn. Controlling that lineage factor would be difficult without the Shadow Sovereign Ability Index, but he thinks that his sword is all he needs. If he had listened to me to begin with and spent more time learning to control it instead of swinging that sword of his all the time, this wouldn't have been that large of an issue. You talk about his stubbornness like you're not worse. You dare to get mad at my grandson when you, too, lost to Ishmael Morales. Now you're trying to project a rivalry of 2 generations ago onto my baby boy. You'd better stop before I teach you a lesson, old man. The old man snorted but didn't say anything in response. Also, you better heal my grandson well until he's satisfied. If not for you old fogies, he wouldn't have gone to the Rapak's nest to begin with, and he wouldn't have suffered that injury. Let him do things the way he wants to. Lionel's breathing was even. He found that his stamina was on a completely different level now. But that didn't stop his body from being drenched in blood that was both his and not his own. Though his wounds had healed, he could feel his healing factor getting slower and slower. However, his eyes still maintained the same coldness, his body zipping around as it basked in a special sort of feeling. Lionel was encircled from all sides. He couldn't even see a clear line to Aina. In fact, their internal sight connection had been severed by whatever interference the dwarven race had concocted. However, he could just barely see her through the flashes of crimson she unleashed. There was no escaping this place, that much Lionel could tell. The door to the throne room was only marginally weaker in defense than the barrier protecting the king and queen. If they could destroy it, they already wouldn't be very far from destroying the mythical beast barrier anyway. It's close. Lionel focused his starry spirit domain on his spear. Every time he pierced outward, he changed something a small bit. The 2-meter radius around him became like a no man's land. He didn't kill with a single strike, but he could force them away, keeping his distance. At the same time, he could limit the number of enemies he had to face at once. Every time the beam would fire, though, his no man's land would shrink, causing a suffocating sort of pressure to press down on him again before he fought it off once again, pushing the pixies and sparrows back. An arrow whizzed through the encirclement and appeared before Lionel's brows. He tilted his head to the side, spinning back with a swift speed and catching the tip of the arrow with his spear blade. The arrow glided along the movement of Lionel's spear, drawing an elegant curve in the arc. Lionel acted with the grace of a dancer but the imposing air of general. His spear whipped back, taking the arrow with it and causing it to streak outward even faster than it had come. At that moment, the fierce glowing light of Lionel's spear seemed to have become a towering, unmatched gold as the spear crown on his forehead grew another size. Chapter 1442. Published at 27th of December 2022, 8:36 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1442. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bonus chapter for 750 golden tickets. Next goal at 1,500 golden tickets, controlled range. The crown upon Lionel's forehead expanded to double its size. The halo above his head flourished, radiating a might that wafted a violet fog. The moment Lionel spoke these words, the skull of the sparrow archer was split in two, the power of the arrow feeling even greater than when Lionel used his level 2 bow force. The enlightenment washed over Lionel. His king's might flooded his spear force. If before it could only hold one part, now it could hold 100 parts. Even without breaking into the 6th dimension, Lionel's spear force had increased its power by an exponential amount. He stomped his feet. Spear force radiated out in all directions, piercing through the encirclement. Illusory violet gold spears pierced through several heads at once, only dissipating after killing at least 3. 5 meters is my absolute death zone. This is my controlled range. Death to those who enter it. The white gold flame of Lionel's eyes were tinged with purple, his flowing white hair gaining the same majesty. It was time to kill his way out of here. Lionel's spear became like a winding flood dragon. Every time it pierced forward, his spear force would roar, unleashing a might that surged forward. At that moment, the destruction runes Lionel had built his king's might upon made their will known. No longer being suppressed by Lionel, it left everything in its wake in a bed of ash. Lionel's left kidney flourished. His sealed fourth-dimensional Scarlet Star Force innate node came to life, flooding his body with a heat that made his bronze runes glow a fiery red. His clothes burst apart, being incinerated to ash. The flames around him rose like a tower, and he unleashed a roar into the skies. The feeling of finally being able to use his innate node felt like a sweeping euphoria pumping through his veins. As though a beast had been unleashed, Lionel wiped out everything within 5 meters of him, his absolute death zone becoming the reflection of a hell's cape. Lionel no longer worried about his spears being destroyed. With the improvement to his spear force, fourth-dimensional Scarlet Star Force under his control wouldn't even leave a dent on them. He stomped his foot hard, barreling forward like a meteor. In the distance, Aina's lip curled. She had believed Lionel would find a solution long ago, so she remained patient. It seemed it was finally time for them to go all out. Her aura flourished, dense tattoos of black covering her neck and body. At that moment, the corpses that littered her surroundings convulsed. The sparrows and pixies' expression warped in horror. They thought that Aina hadn't used this ability again because she had reached her limit. Little did they know that this was far from the case. How could she reach her limit when this action in and of itself fueled her? Lionel shot around the throne room like a barreling cannonball. Every he landed, a 5-meter radius would be opened, a violent torrent of fire and spear force tearing through flesh and burning it to ash. That's it. Lionel's figure flickered, his river-like hair and large, looming tail streaking to his back like an ethereal dream. He appeared above a location, cocking his spear back. A dragon's roar seemed to leave his spear once again as he pierced down, the white gold-violet flame blazing in place of his eyes dancing with destruction runes. The sparrows and pixies worked together to block it, but it was already too late. Lionel's spear crashed into the marbled ground. His spear force shattered against it, his flames dancing across the surface like shards of broken glass. The marbled floors hardly suffered any damage whatsoever. However, Lionel vanished as though it didn't matter to him, appearing above another location and repeating, and then doing it once again. He flashed through the air with a speed even the sparrows and pixies couldn't match. He seemed to step on the air itself, his movements leaving small circles of wind across the throne room. Final one. A low shout left Lionel's lips as he pierced down. A formation that could keep him trapped. Maybe if it was 7th dimension it would have had a chance. In fact, as long as it kept its tail tucked between its legs and remained hidden behind the 7th dimensional materials that protected it, it could have survived a bit longer. However, the moment it had reared its head, it was destined to fall. There was no force art that could trap him for long. Boom! All at once, the statues of majestic beasts across the throne room crumbled. The bustle around the 3-star goblin zone was only increasing. As the bet became more widespread, information about this zone began to circulate and the origin of its difficulty became known. Originally, this was meant to be a simple zone to clear. The target was the goblin race, but they weren't even a high-level bloodline of the goblin race, they were just the green and gray skins. Compared to other high-level goblins, these were lacking. They didn't have the strongest lineage factors nor did they have access to the best ability indexes, so they couldn't even lean into the greatest strengths of their race as much as they should. However, because of an odd mutation to the zone, causing all the nobles aside from the dukes to be perpetually gathered in the throne room, a simple mission had become nigh impossible. Those that managed to come out even spoke about a barrier that erupted in the throne room. They were forced to decide whether to use the last dregs of their strength to break the door or attack the king and queen. Without much of a choice, most could only decide to go for the door. With such a challenge, it was hotly contested whether or not Lionel and Aina would be able to live, let alone clear it. But, just when the discussions were growing feverish, on the fourth day, 3 days before the deadline, the portal opened. Chapter 1443. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1443. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel, who was stark naked from head to toe aside from a small pixie shield blocking his most private area, was speechless. Wasn't this region barren of people? When the hell did they get such a large audience? Luckily, you could take objects out of a unique zone like this one, or else he wouldn't have anything to work with but his hands. The original plan was for Aina to go and get him another set of robes since nothing the dwarven race had would fit him. But, it seemed that plan had flown out of the window. Aina, who was by his side, was stunned as well. But, when she looked at Lionel, she couldn't help but roll her lips over, trying to hold back her laughter. "What are you laughing about?" Lionel raised a brow. "It's you who's taking a loss here." Lionel's figure, under the influence of metal body, put fitness models to shame. He made more vascularity than he knew what to do with, and even his smallest oblique muscles were defined and bulging. He had lean muscle mass coming out of places others didn't even know existed, and he wasn't easily embarrassed to begin with. So, as far as he was concerned, it really was Aina who was taking a loss here. Aina, who seemed to suddenly realize this as well, stopped laughing, sending a glare into the crowd. Seeing the blushing faces of some of the women in the ground, she turned her glare from them back to Lionel, who was caught between laughter and trying to maintain a serious expression. How was it his fault? Plus, weren't you laughing first? Bang! Aina's battle axe swung outward, slicing into the ground just a half centimeter from Lionel's toes. Lionel's lip twitched. The enormous double axe blocked everything all the way up to his neck. He could barely peek over. This method worked too. But, did you need to swing so close to my feet like that? I need those to walk and stuff. Aina's actions seemed to cause the deathly silent atmosphere to boil over. In one moment, there was a harsh silence, and in the next moment, there was an uproar. The only way the portal would open 3 days early was if they had passed. When everyone realized this, those that had bet on their survival cheered while those who had bet on their failure clicked their tongues, turning around and leaving so that they wouldn't have to deal with the celebration that had little to do with them. Lionel, who had been trying to appease Aina, raised an eyebrow again, looking outward. There was something odd about this. He immediately saw the crowd split into 2 groups. No, there was a third group, individuals who rushed off not to avoid the celebration, but rather seemed to be in a hurry. Likely a hurry to report something? Lionel took all of this in. It seems that someone spread the news of our bet. It's unlikely to be Dimitri, and the only other person who knew was Orinik, so it must have been him. Considering the crowd's reaction, they seem to have been just as invested in this as we were. The only way for such a thing to happen is if Lionel only believed that there were 2 possible explanations. The first was related to a rivalry between sword and spear. There were many factions in the Void Palace, but none were more contentious than these 2 groups. It went beyond factions and parties and acted as 2 clashing ideologies. It was possible that Lionel's entry had caused such a spat. The second explanation was that someone had formed a betting ring around their performance. Lionel's gaze scanned the crowd again. He felt that there was a better than 80% chance that it was that latter, with much of the remaining 20% taken up by the first possibility. Orinik isn't here. But, he will be here soon. Let's wait here. Lionel suddenly said when Aina was about to go and get him clothes. Very soon, there'll be someone who obediently goes to get what I need. Aina raised an eyebrow, not quite understanding. But, as far as Lionel was concerned, why have Aina go run this errand when someone else would? Lionel stood in patient silence. Eventually, as expected, Orinik came over not long afterward. He had still been focused on spreading the news and getting more to bet. He hadn't expected that Lionel and Aina would survive to begin with, so he knew he had to work harder during the earlier days, or else as time waned, people would be less and less likely to bet. His eyes flashed when he saw Lionel and Aina standing practically unscathed. Though Lionel had been covered in blood, his flames had long since burnt that away. As for Aina, her self-healing abilities were beyond what most could hope to compare to, and she could control blood freely. Why would she allow it to be wasted by drying on her clothes? However, Orinik soon calmed. No matter what, he had made a fortune. With it, he would be able to increase the distance between himself and Lionel wider than it already was. He had no need to worry about Lionel at all. It was a bit unfortunate he couldn't make more money, but his void point totals were already plateauing. Now, he just had to pay everyone what he owed him, take his cut, and be on his way. Turning his head away from Lionel and Aina as though they were there at all, he gave everyone a bright smile. Please form a line, everyone. Present your betting tokens. I have your winnings here. The crowd did as they were told even as the envoys returned. From start to finish, Lionel didn't say a word, just continuing to stand there. His cold eyes receded, a light smile plastered on his face. It took several hours, but the crowd only seemed to be growing. It was only after the last voucher was processed and Orinik was brimming with happiness that Lionel cleared his throat. Are you perhaps forgetting something? Chapter 1444. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1444. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Orinik, who had planned on slipping away to go and tally his winning, frowned. Eventually, he calmed. He really wanted to see what Lionel would dare to do. He had a lot of ammo on Lionel. Hardly anyone believed that he had really climbed to the 74th floor, and even if it wasn't true, he could easily weave a tale that said that Lionel had only relied on Aina to pass. On top of that, there were plenty of sword faction geniuses waiting for a chance to get revenge for what Velasco had done. On top of that, with his information network, Orinik heard that Lionel also had a grudge with the Vierer family genius due to what he had done to one of her younger sisters, not to mention the fact that Aina had knocked her off of the ranking. As if that wasn't ammo enough, Orinik also heard of Lionel's clash with the archer genius of the Terrius family. News of his claiming the White Lion Bao was spreading slowly among relevant factions, but it was definitely a ticking time bomb waiting to burst. None of that even mentioned the fact that Aina had rejected the third-ranked Queen Beauty and that Vega was waiting for an opportunity to capitalize. Rather than ammo, it was more accurate to say that Orinik had an entire artillery unit to take advantage of. He could hit Lionel's reputation, his livelihood, and even his life itself if he so chose. He just had to choose which button to press. He had always been a cautious person. Even though he knew it was almost impossible for Lionel and Aina to survive, he had still covered all his bases. He had already been paying attention to Lionel because he knew that he had offended him, but he had dialed up all his effort 100-fold. If Lionel hadn't held a grudge before, Orinik knew he would be able to avoid it this time. And, judging by Lionel's earlier killing intent, it was clear they were already long past the point of no return. So, when he faced Lionel this time, his sneer only deepened with each passing second. He knew that there was no point in trying to mend fences. In that case, he didn't have to lower his face at all. With this push, in a year or two, he might be able to become a sector-ranked disciple. Even with their talent, Lionel and Aina were at least a decade if not further away from such a goal. If they thought he was easy to deal with just because they cleared a 3-star void mission, they would find themselves sorely mistaken very soon. What did I forget, exactly? The crowd looked on with curiosity, sensing the tense atmosphere. Many of them understood. Orinik had made quite the sum being the arbiter of this bet. They were already a bit dissatisfied by this, but it must be dialed up 100-fold for Lionel and Aina, whose life and death was treated like a game to bet on in the first place. Even if they were unsatisfied, they could only accept that Orinik was luckier than they were. After all, he was the one who found out that this was happening before the rest of them did. However, it seemed that Lionel was unwilling to swallow this loss. Either way, there was another show to watch, so why not bask in it? Quite a lot, actually. Are you aware that bets need an overseer and a guarantor? Lionel knew that there was no way that Orinik could cover the insurance for all these bets by himself. And none of these students would be stupid enough to just hand over their hard-earned void points without a guarantee that they would have their winnings paid out. That was the simple truth. Orinik, hearing this question, only sneered deeper. Is that your question? It's the first. Lionel responded, unhurried. You're naive and overestimating yourself. I've already verified this bet through the gold standard faction. In addition, according to the rules, guarantors are only needed depending on the betting line and the betting pool available. Because of the bets taken, both sides were covered and could account for one another. A guarantor wasn't needed. Because of Orinik's style of advertising, the odds were split quite evenly. In fact, he placed the odds that Lionel and Aina would die and survive at equal. No matter which side won, the payouts would be manageable. Although skewing heavily to one side would have netted him far more if he won, he was, by nature, a cautious person. And, in the end, he benefited from it. Ah, so you're aware of this as well. That's good. That means I have less to explain. So you should be aware of the restrictions on betting and rank, correct? Of course I am. Orinik laughed. Unfortunately for you, such restrictions don't exist because we are the same rank. Are we? Lionel asked lightly. According to the rules, when holding a betting event, bids by those of a higher rank on a bet subject to the actions of a disciple of lower rank are heavily taxed. This tax isn't applied on the winnings themselves, but rather the betting odds. So, if a sector-ranked disciple joined this bet where winning would give them a 1/10 outcome, for example, they would only receive half of that, giving them a 1:5 outcome instead. If you're 2 ranks above, the penalty is even harsher. You would only get 1:2 odds from an originally 1/10 payout. These taxes are in place so that higher-ranked disciples are less likely to join and influence the matters of lesser ranks. The more Lionel spoke, the more Orinik's brows furrowed. This was because Lionel's familiarity with the rules was far beyond his expectations. He knew all of these things already, so why was he reciting these things back to him? It also happens to be, according to the rules, that when bets involve those outside of the Void Palace, or, according to the specific language in the codified law, unranked individuals, the faction that set up the bet is meant to pay a 50% tax on all earnings. In addition to this, it requires written consent of the unranked party. This rule, of course, is in place to ensure that Void Palace geniuses don't use the human domain like it's a board game to be toyed with as they please. After all, there are real lives on the line out there. So tell me, Orinik, did you observe these practices? Chapter 1445. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1445. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. There's an odd situation going on in the comments section of last that claims that I passed off a normal chapter as a bonus chapter yesterday. I'm not sure where this narrative came from, or if it's a joke that's going over my head, but to clarify, I uploaded 4 chapters yesterday, one more than the promised 3, that much should be obvious. I'll post screenshots of the Discord bot activity with timestamps as proof in the comments section of this chapter. Orinik's forehead beaded with sweat. The more Lionel talked about the rules, the more he felt like he had forgotten something. But, no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't come up with a reason why Lionel would sound so confident. A part of him wanted to believe that Lionel was just a fool, but as he recited the laws basically word for word, the sinking feeling in Orinik's gut only grew heavier and heavier. Aina. HM. Lionel grinned. What rank am I? Aina blinked, seemingly thinking. But, she eventually shook her head. I don't know, the Void Senate hasn't given you a rank yet. The moment Aina said these words, Orinik's dark skin flushed, his eyes almost rolled to the back of his head. It felt like his heart was about to fly out of his throat. This wasn't a small problem in the slightest. Not only had he broken the law, it was a law with the harshest of punishments. Killing was prohibited in the Void Palace, but another enormous taboo was negatively influencing the human domain. They were chosen to be the protectors of mankind. They couldn't be protectors if they were exploiting the people they had to protect. Even the lightest punishment for such a thing would be dozens of years of hard labor. On the other end, there was direct execution. If Lionel reported this, he was finished. But that was only the first issue. Orinik still had to deal with the Gold Standard faction. Orinik suddenly realized that no matter what he did, he would be suffering this time around. Through his blurred vision, Orinik could see the crowd looking around in confusion. It made him realize that Lionel had spoken these words for only him to hear. But of course he would. How could Lionel allow someone else to take advantage of this juicy piece of meat he had caught? How ridiculous. However, when everyone saw Orinik's reaction, their expressions changed. None of them were fools. They realized that Lionel had caught onto the latter's weakness even if they wouldn't be privy to what it was. What? What do you want? Orinik spoke through gritted teeth. Lionel smiled lightly. I'm glad you've come around. This makes things easy. I'll sign a contract to keep mum about these matters, and you just have to do a few things for me. Firstly, I'm in need of some clothes. There's an uncomfortable draft around here. Aina bit her lip, trying to refrain from laughing. Did this man even feel the cold to begin with? He had a raging furnace inside his body. By the time he sensed a wind, it would have been charred to a smoldering heat. Orinik's lip trembled, his fists clenching tight. But, after a moment, he began drawing up a contract, placing down Lionel's demands. I'll need the token you received to the Void Library as a reward for your work done as an envoy, and I'll also need 70% of the profit you made on this bet. When Lionel finished, Orinik was nothing more than a deflated man. However, his expression had regained its calm, his hands becoming steadier and steadier the more he wrote. In the end, he didn't hesitate to hand over everything Lionel asked for. After reading through the contract, Lionel nodded and signed it, accepting all of his rewards. He left Orinik with just enough to pay the Gold Standard faction the 30% cut he owed them while stripping him of practically everything else. Lionel would have taken more, but he felt that he already had enough enemies. There was no need to be on the bad side of a silver-grade faction when he had already gained so much. Soon, Orinik returned with the clothing he owed Lionel and disappeared, not saying another word from start to finish. He's a problem, Aina said after Lionel finished dressing himself. She didn't like the fact Orinik had regained his calm so easily. Or, at the very least, she didn't like that it looked like he had. Lionel smiled, but it was decidedly colder than it had been previously. I hope he continues to be a problem. If not, then what excuse would I have to humiliate him some more? The crowd watched Lionel and Aina stroll off as though nothing special had happened. The speculation about how Lionel had done it ran rampant, but no one had a solid clue about exactly what had happened. They could only make their own guesses. Lionel knew what the most likely rumor would be, so he knew it would be troublesome. But he chose to ignore it for now. Orinik had given him what he needed most. A token to the Void Library was difficult to get and cost a pretty sum of Void points and merits just for a small time. However, now Lionel had one in his hand at no cost to himself. The Void Palace wasn't fond of hand-holding, so there was no easy way to learn anything. Everything cost. However, this time, Lionel wasn't going to learn about the 6 dimensions God path like most thought he might. Instead, he was going to see what he could find out about the segmented cube and how to get it back. If he had the time remaining, he would also see what he could find out about the spear domain ring and learn what was going on with it. I think only one of us can enter. This token gives me 1 day, so I'll be back after that. Aina nodded. All right. I'm going to see what I can find out about getting us a place to stay. It shouldn't be difficult with how many points we have. After saying this, the couple parted and Lionel soon found himself at the bottom of a winding set of black stairs built right into the side of a mountain he couldn't see the peak of. In fact, now that he thought about it, he couldn't see the end of the stairs either, even when his head angled all the way up. Lionel sighed. Why can't anything be easy in this place? Chapter 1446. Published at 27th of December 2022, 8:36 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1446. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a breath, stepping on the first stair. Whether by coincidence or design, a rush of wind blew his hair back, the pressure causing his clothing to flutter. When Lionel took his second step, this happened again, causing his eyes to narrow. This wasn't a coincidence. The wind just now was exactly 0.1% stronger than the first one. And, when he took his third step, it increased by exactly the same margin. Lionel's head tilted up. It seemed that the token just gave you a chance and didn't even guarantee entry. He could feel a formless pressure that wouldn't even allow him to start climbing if he didn't have the token in the first place. Still, Lionel felt that it somewhat made sense that things were like this. Usually, the Void Library was sealed off. The only way to gain access to the texts, techniques, books and tomes within was to exchange for a copy at any one of the Senate branches. However, when taking that route, you were limited by both your rank and price. However, if you gained a token to enter, you could read texts of any level, at no price at all, for a 24-hour period. The price of this token was definitely worth its weight in gold. That said, to most, it was a scam. You couldn't even digest what you read in 24 hours. And, getting the books themselves was a whole other ordeal, not to mention the fact the time spent climbing the stairs was part of your 24 hours chance. Lionel took a deeper breath, his gaze flashing as a radiant spear crown appeared around his forehead. A low cyclone of wind suddenly formed at a 5-meter radius away from him, kicking up air and dust as though a helicopter was landing. No one steps foot in his spear domain without his permission. Lionel's body flooded with ethereal star force, his foot pressing down on the fourth step hard before he shot forward like a bullet. He crossed 10 stairs at a time, blazing a trail of white gold as he soared, his steps only becoming faster and faster. 3 illusory tails appeared to his back, shining a blinding light in the darkness. He was the torch in an endless light, his steps only becoming faster as the pressure increased. The resounding sound of a shattering barrier resounded as Lionel crossed the halfway point. His gaze shone with spear force, a forceful intent thrumming within his limbs. Break. Within his spear domain, several lines of violet gold spear force formed, converging onto a single point before Lionel as though he himself had become a spear. Break. 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 Lionel shot by some who still remained struggling on the staircase, his eyes focused on the peak. He didn't seem to care how far away it was or how long it would take. All he could think was that he refused to slow his effort until he touched the last staircase. Little Blackstar was like a little brother to him at this point. Little Tolly was his lifelong partner, a partner he would never abandon. The Void Library represented the chance he needed, he didn't have time to waste on this staircase. Lionel's intent burned like an eternal fire, his violet gold spear force gaining heated edges of blazing crimson as his eyes danced with destruction runes. The sound of shattering barriers shifted, a quaking boom resounding every time Lionel crossed 100 steps. From a wind that blew his hair back, Lionel began to face winds as heavy as mountains and as lethal as falling boulders. But, he shot through it all, sparkling shards of space and winds falling around him. Lionel roared, his ethereal star force pacing through space and shattering the barriers from the inside out. It felt like he couldn't be stopped, he wouldn't be stopped. Lionel's foot heavily stomped against a stair, his body retracting like a compressed spring and his thighs bulging to twice their usual size. His Achilles tendon vibrated like steel cord, the power charged within it enough to make the ground tremble. Then, he released everything he had, an explosive boom ringing out as he shot through the sound barrier. A clap of thunder burst the eardrums of all those that heard it, the fog in the surroundings dispersing for several hundred meters. Lionel's body appeared high above the staircase, the enormous size of the Void Library appearing before his eyes while the gazes of those below fell onto him. Bang! Lionel fell heavily to the ground, his body releasing a billow steam. His reddened bronze runes receded, a long breath being released from his lips that sparked the air with red gold fire. Lionel slicked his sweaty hair back, looking up at the building before him and ignoring the narrowed gazes that had focused on him. The disciples that frequented this place were most definitely domain-ranked disciples. They had probably never seen a fifth-dimensional existence step foot here. Of course, the difficulty of scaling the steps was adjusted by a person's level. The fact that Lionel was only in the fifth dimension actually helped him greatly. But others couldn't help but be shocked nonetheless. The reason for this was because it usually required stepping into the God path to climb to the top of the stairs. That was because one needed the aid of God runes to make it here. To make it here in the fifth dimension was quite shocking. But, if they knew that Lionel had an innate node, it would be easier to accept, reason being an innate node was like a cheat to gaining God runes long before the sixth dimension. And it was precisely because of this reason that Conan dared to say the rest of them would catch up to Lionel once they broke into the sixth dimension. That said, Lionel had no intention of caring for Conan's words. It took me almost 2 hours to climb to this place. I have a bit over 22 hours left. I can't waste any more time. Lionel flashed forward, ignoring the domain-ranked disciples. Chapter 1447. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1447. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel hardly took any time to bask in the majesty of the Void Library's glory. He meant it when he said that he didn't have time to waste. While the domain-ranked disciples could casually sit, eat and chat, taking a break as they pleased, he didn't have such a luxury. In about a day, the token that was on him would crumble and he would be ejected. Watching Lionel charge in, the domain-ranked disciples raised an eyebrow before smiling and shaking their heads. They had seen such a scene many times before. It was unfortunate that those that came here for the first time were a bit ignorant to how things worked, and as such, they would end up suffering a bit. Things didn't work as one might expect, or else they, as domain-ranked disciples, wouldn't need to take breaks like this. They were still a bit curious about Lionel, though. They were sharp enough to sense the Scarlet Star force he had just used, and they could tell his spear force wasn't normal. It even seemed close to perfection. The moment Lionel charged into the Void Library, he quickly learned why the domain-ranked disciples had amused expressions. He had expected to find stacked bookcases that rose into the skies with row after row of books in an endless sea of paper and knowledge. Or, at the very least, if he was wrong about that, then there would be row upon rows of pendants. But, he couldn't have been more incorrect in his assessment. The moment Lionel crossed the barrier of the entrance, he fell forward, losing his balance. This was something that shocked him to no end. With his coordination, even if he hadn't calculated that stat for himself in years, there was no way he would casually lose his balance without reason or cause. He fell forward. But, instead of his head hitting the ground, his arm flailed, the gravity around him vanishing. It felt like he was falling through space, but there was no harsh wind to be found. Lionel flailed his arms one more time because he suddenly realized he wasn't falling at all. Rather, he was floating in space. The moment he realized this, he instantly found his center, straightening himself and looking around. He found that there was no one around him at all. In fact, it felt like he was truly in the depths of space. There were even motes of light floating around that felt like distant stars. Lionel blinked in confusion, not sure what was going on. For a moment, his heart skipped several beats as this reminded him of the changes to his dream world. Could it be that he was trapped in a dream again? What was going on? No, I'm not in a dream, I would be able to tell. This is the library, then? How does this work? How do I find books? Lionel tried to move, but he soon found that if he did, he would end up flailing again. Moving was absolutely impossible. In fact, he had a feeling that even if he had his wings back from his snowy star owl lineage factor, he would still be incapable of moving through this space. So I'm meant to stay in place, then? How do I? Lionel subconsciously reached out with his internal sight, only for the distant motes of light to suddenly shoot right up to his face. The world around him warped as though he had entered some sort of light-speed hyperdrive, streaking and flashing lights surrounding him. Lionel froze up, stopping everything immediately. He felt a little disoriented, and he even felt that his stamina had taken a small hit. So, this is how it works. You weren't supposed to move physically, you were supposed to use your internal sight to navigate around this region. If Lionel was correct, these motes of light were probably also the representations of the information he needed. Lionel reached out and touched one, and the result was exactly like what he had felt when he touched the pendant in the Senate branch. The information flooded his mind, and he was soon pulled into a world of glaive techniques. Lionel eventually pulled back, shaking his head. This information wasn't useful to him at all. There had to be a way to organize all of this. They couldn't possibly expect him to just randomly go through all these lights one by one, right? The moment Lionel thought the word organize, though, there was another chunk taken out of his stamina, and the motes of light around him began to shift around, separating into what Lionel subconsciously knew were techniques, historical recountings, and the last was related to medicine. When Lionel saw this, he was left speechless. "You've got to be kidding me, whoever designed the function of the Void Library was a sick bastard," that was Lionel's conclusion, and refused to move off of it. After several wasted minutes, Lionel came to understand that the Void Library was a lot like the Void Tower. It was a world filled to the brim with hidden information. While the Void Library had information like techniques and historical facts, the Void Tower formed its information into enemies for the Void Palace's disciple to fight and kill. When someone entered the Void Library, they were really entering their own personal library. They gained access to a whole host of information, but it was completely unorganized and left in a garbled mess. It reminded Lionel of the internet, except now, instead of relying on a computer or search engine to organize things for you, you had to use your own internal sight and stamina. If Lionel wanted to find something, he needed to exchange his own mind's computing power to file and organize things, and only then could he benefit from the Void Library. Lionel grit his teeth. This amount of information made the 500,000 years worth of laws look like child's play. The Void Palace didn't just have the laws of the Void Palace, but a vast endless sea of information on top of that. Those laws couldn't even make up a percent of the information here. "Fine, if you want to play, let's play." Lionel's gaze blazed. Chapter 1448. Published at 27th of December 2022, 8:36 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1448. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took several deep breaths. His body was aching from the climb, but without the slightest hesitation, he activated. He gained a usage a day regardless. By the time he got out of here, there would only be 2 more hours until he could use it again. He would be foolish to not use it to bring himself to tip-top condition. The fatigue that filled his limbs vanished and his mind felt refreshed. Right then, he deployed his internal sight in full force. He came up with the most efficient system almost instantly. He would use his internal sight's maximum range to navigate, and when the motes of light entered the range of his starry spirit domain, only then would he organize them. Lionel posited that because he could deploy his dream force within the range of his starry spirit domain, his dream force affinity was also maximized in that range. Additionally, if he was correct, the Void Library should work on principles of dream force just like the Void Tower had. In that case, the stamina he would need to compute and organize these motes of line would be minimized to an extreme. Lionel couldn't have been more correct. The moment the motes of light touched his starry spirit domain, he didn't even need to send his mind into them to understand what their function was. Very quickly, a network of interconnected motes of light began to form around him, growing into a larger and larger web. As his web grew, Lionel realized that organizing like motes of light became easier. The more movement techniques he collected, for example, the easier it was to identify other movement techniques. Eventually, when Lionel reached a certain point of saturation, even his internal sight could organize movement techniques without passing them through his starry spirit domain first. When he reached the next threshold, his eyes alone were enough. Soon, the motes of light that Lionel could hardly tell the difference between began to shine with varying degrees of light and color. Just by looking at them, Lionel could tell what categories they fell into and slot them in without much issue. Even though things were going very smoothly, when Lionel reached the next threshold, he could only sigh. Now, he could not only see the category the motes of light fell into, but he could also see their grades, dimension level, and eventually their length. Due to this, Lionel realized that the motes of light he was organizing right now weren't even fifth-dimensional, they were all fourth-dimensional. They were all the lowest grades of information the Void Palace had to offer, yet there was so much of it. Lionel grit his teeth. A part of him wanted to blaze through and ignore it all, but he was certain that he needed to lay this foundation. No matter how long it took, he needed to organize all of this fourth-dimensional information. Once he did, seeing through the higher dimensional information would become far easier. In fact, Lionel went even further than that. He didn't just organize the fourth-dimensional information, but he continued onward to split his mind in two, organizing himself into two supercomputers. One focused on deciphering information and the other half began to consume the information. After just a few, Lionel realized that he was right. Actually digesting the information felt like he was training his mind like an artificial intelligence. It made seeing through the next motes of lights even easier. If Lionel knew exactly what he was looking for, he would focus on absorbing only that information. Unfortunately, he didn't know what categories the information he needed to save the segmented cube fell under. It could be in a spatial technique, but it could also be in a historical recounting, or it could be in a crafting technique, he had no idea. He had to cover all of his bases for just the smallest sliver of a chance to find the information he needed, so absorbed it all. He left no fourth-dimensional mode of light unturned, swallowing it all like a glutton. At that moment, outside the Void Library, an odd scene was taking place. The domain-ranked disciples, most of whom couldn't even be bothered with Lionel previously, raised a brow as they all looked toward the same location. The reason was quite simple. Lionel had been in there for 3 hours already. Most, on their first attempt, could only last a few minutes before being overwhelmed. Only the absolute strongest could spend hours at a time without an issue. Beyond this, domain-ranked disciples understood many things lower-ranked disciples could not. There was a reason the Void Palace had so many locations like the Void Tower and the Void Library. The appearance of someone who could perform so well in them wasn't a small deal in the slightest. Beads of sweat fell down Lionel's brow as he pushed himself harder and harder. He didn't leave a single stone of the fourth dimension unturned, his pressure reaching a relentless level. If his sixth-dimensional mind wasn't restricted by his current fifth-dimensional level, he wouldn't be nearly so pressed right now. However, regardless of how he felt, he pushed forward, pressing onward to the fourth hour, and then the fifth. It had taken Lionel no more than a few seconds to go through over 500,000 years of laws previously, and yet he had taken 5 hours just to clear the Void Library of all of its fourth-dimensional information. The reality was enough to even shock him. The sheer amount of information was astounding. But, Lionel couldn't bask in this feeling at all. Heaving deep breaths, he looked at the sky. Now, the motes of light were no longer bland blobs of white. Some shined red, others blue, some in between, others green and yellow. The selection felt endless. However, in Lionel's eyes, he could see faint lines connecting them to his fluttering network of fourth-dimensional information. Lionel didn't realize it, but he had finally closed up all his foundational misunderstandings about the dimensional verse. He was finally no longer a novice. Right now, though, he needed more. I'll start with the most obvious. You. Lionel grasped outward, his internal sight sending him shooting forward as he appeared before a sixth-dimension mode of light, a bit of information usually restricted to disciples above the third galaxy rank. He couldn't see the names of sixth-dimensional motes of light without allowing them into his starry spirit domain, unlike with fifth-dimensional ones. This told Lionel that his current network was enough to elucidate up to the sixth dimension, but he would likely have to go through everything of the fifth dimension for information of the seventh dimension to begin to clarify themselves by a small measure. This wasn't unexpected. Mere fourth-dimensional information couldn't possibly open him up to everything here, but it was definitely an excellent starting point. However, he hoped that he would be able to find the information he needed within the fifth or sixth dimensional layers. Lionel sunk his mind into the mode of light. Chapter 1449. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1449. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel found his mind enveloped, his pupils flickering and bouncing aimlessly as he seemed to be reading through something despite the fact there was nothing but a mode of light before him. It took much more time to go through this information. It was dense and its explanations were far deeper than just words of written law. The principles felt more profound than anything Lionel had ever read before. This knowledge in particular didn't fall under the category of technique or historical recounting, rather, it felt more like a PhD thesis. There were a ton of references and much of it was actually theory. But, as Lionel's mind sunk further and further into it, his comprehension seemed to open up. Without even trying, the references noted in the research paper shot over from a distance, adding themselves to Lionel's network of their own volition. Some were actually seventh-dimensional, but the vast majority were fifth-dimensional. So focusing on research papers is actually another shortcut. This is good to know. Lionel hadn't realized this before for quite a simple reason. There simply were no research papers of the fourth dimension. All the information of the fourth dimension were either cold hard facts or techniques. After all, everything in the fourth dimension had practically already been excavated and comprehended to the fullest extent. They were no longer theories, they were just objective realities. It took Lionel a few minutes, but he finally went through it all. Pulling his mind back, he exhaled a long breath. Interesting. The research paper wasn't anything groundbreaking. Like most PhDs, it was just a tweak and critique of a smaller theory that already existed. In fact, it was one of many that worked on expounding the same theory, which made it far more reliable as it wasn't some out there shot in the dark. According to the paper, manipulating space and anarchic force was difficult for reasons outside of their expectations. Anarchic force didn't destroy things, it devoured things, turning them into nothing as though they never existed in the first place. But, what did that mean for space? It had to be remembered that those with high attainments in spatial force were seen to be great threats to the point where most strongholds had counters for them despite their rarity. Lionel had experienced this personally during his battle for Earth and its subsidiary planets. Space was ubiquitous, but it was also the only type of force that was easier to use the less of it there was. The more spatial force there was in the region, the more solid the space was, and thus the more difficult it was to use spatial force for maneuvering. The research paper claimed, then, that one shouldn't be fighting against anarchic force when manipulating spatial force in this sort of environment. Rather, one should make use of anarchic force to help. Of course, one couldn't just take control of anarchic force. Lionel wasn't sure that there was anyone that could control anarchic force. It did as it pleased and there was no existence with an affinity for it. Even void beasts could only be considered immune, but that didn't give them the right to control anarchic force. Only the regulator could do that. However, you could take advantage of the characteristics of anarchic force to make it work for you. Anarchic force flowed toward regions of high force concentrations. Its instinct was to devour. If you made use of this to force anarchic force to target and create a flaw in space, then teleporting would actually become easy. There were obviously many problems with this theory. For example, the anarchic force you used wouldn't just vanish after it was done with its task, it would obviously be there. Even in the best case, you would have to keep the teleportation short to cut off the hounding of anarchic force toward yourself. In the worst case, you would die mid-teleportation, devoured by the battle between space and anarchic force. The research paper posited several solutions to this which included several force manipulation and pattern techniques. In one example, they suggested forming your force into a maze-like lotus formation. According to their research, anarchic force took the longest to get to the center of such a formation of force as it had to devour the outer structural integrity first. This design allowed the inner workings to remain unharmed and structurally sound during the teleportation. According to this, this method was safe for movements within 10 meters, any further and the structure would crumble before you could make it out. Of course, the idea of forming a complex maze lotus monstrosity in the middle of battle all for the sake of teleporting just 10 meters was ridiculous. Even back in his Camelot days, it only took Lionel about 2 or 3 seconds to cast even the most complicated of techniques. If he used this method, it would take even his current self upwards of 5 seconds to finish. Unless... Lionel's gaze narrowed. Because he could now project his dream world into the real world so long as it was within his starry spirit domain, his control within that region was unprecedented. It was like his control of his own body had extended out from him. While it would theoretically take time to form his maze lotus with his spatial force or his ethereal star force which had spatial attributes, he could form it in less than a single blink of an eye with his dream force. If he projected that maze lotus into the real world, and then set a command within his body to constrain his spatial force to that area and that area alone, it would take me about half a second with that approach. That's still quite a long time in battles at this level, but it'll also be troublesome if my enemies can just see what I'm preparing in advance. Lionel's gaze glowed. Who said his enemies had to see what he was preparing? It was his dream world, he could make it invisible if he wanted to. Chapter 1450. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1450. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel continued blazing through research papers, realizing that he had gotten sidetracked. That paper had been helpful, but unfortunately, it didn't give him anything he needed on fixing the segmented cube. Lionel chose to focus his efforts a bit more. He could search for segmented cube relating things specifically, but he felt that there would be low odds of finding anything useful through this route. There were a few reasons for this. First, the segmented cube was the heirloom of the Morales family. He highly doubted that they would allow information about it to be so easily accessible. From what Lionel had seen of the Void Palace, though this was supposed to be the frontier of humanity, the influence individual families had was very heavy. If not for this, there would be a sword and spear division, nor would that Bowman genius have threatened him with their alliance despite the fact that there was a very clear no-killing policy here. It was likely that the Void Palace was probably being pulled in all sorts of directions by the undercurrents of the family supposedly beneath them. The second reason Lionel didn't bother to take this route was also because of this. As the heirloom of the Morales family, the segmented cube had probably spent most of its life highly protected. The odds that something like this had happened before was slim to none, and even if it had, the Morales family would have definitely no disseminated information about it. Of course, Lionel had thought of the possibility that the segmented cube had a history before the Morales family. However, he deduced that focusing on this category in specific was a better use of his time. Only if it failed would he take that approach. That category, being spatial devices and crafting. Lionel read through every crafting light he could get his hands on that even remotely mentioned spatial devices, trying to see what he could learn. However, even after going through everything in the fifth dimension, he found himself exhausted, beating with sweat, having a drained mind, and still being no closer to finding an answer. The only good thing was that he had learned a lot about crafting under the influence of anarchic force. But that wasn't what he needed right now. Lionel sent his mind toward his token, realizing now that he had already gone through 20 hours of allotted time. He could hardly see the number straight, he felt like he might collapse at any time. This approach is wrong, Lionel's brows furrowed. After reading all of those papers, he understood something. For spatial treasures at the fifth dimensional level or could be classified within fifth dimensional information, they would never survive the collapse of their space to begin with. Something like what happened with Lionel's segmented cube, where the exterior remained and Lionel was even capable of sending his mind inside to see what happened, would never happen to such low-level treasures. The information he needed would never have been found at such a low level to begin with. Lionel hesitated. Should he read about the history of the segmented cube if he could find it? No. It's not that this approach is wrong, it's rather that I haven't gone deep enough. This time hasn't been wasted, it might be just enough for me to be able to see, Lionel's mind flashed with the last dregs of its strength, zooming towards seventh-dimensional information. His thoughts were simple. With how things were like right now, he had just gone through countless research papers that touched on crafting spatial force treasures. With that being the case, then it was likely that other related topics would also be far easier for him to pick out at a distance. As expected, without Lionel even doing anything, all research papers, techniques, and even history recounting related to spatial treasures and their crafting entered his network without him even lifting a finger. Very soon, a large swarm of six-dimensional motes of light joined Lionel's network, fusing with the web of his personal library and growing its size. It wasn't until Lionel entered the range of the seventh dimension that the process slowed. Lionel's gaze flickered. The pressure here was almost impossible to manage, but he grit his teeth, holding on. He didn't even know if he had the mental strength left to even take on a seventh-dimensional light. But he had no choice. He just had to pick right. That one, that's going to be the one. Lionel took a breath, focusing his eyes on one of the only three he could see the names of. Lionel felt that it might have what he needed. It sounded ridiculous. The title was more of something he would find in the fourth dimension, not the seventh. Plus, the segmented cube hadn't reached the end of its lifetime. But Lionel had his own reasons for making this choice. Come. Lionel grasped the mode of light and it felt as though a bang had gone off in his mind. If not for the sturdy seventh-dimensional walls of his psyche, Lionel's heart skipped a beat in fear. Just now, his mind could have collapsed. He realized that he had been far too reckless. It was a good thing his starry-tailed fox lineage factor's wisdom branch had been fully awakened, or else he would have been seriously injured, and that was only if he managed to avoid being killed. Despite its simple name, this information was without a doubt seventh-dimensional. The vast stores of information were beyond anything Lionel had ever seen before. He had yet to get far enough in his father's training to receive information of his caliber. In fact, Lionel realized that if it wasn't for his recent breakthroughs in comprehension, he wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of this research paper. His mind split like a bolt of lightning was trying to bisect it. However, he held on. Just as Lionel reached the final pages of the research paper, his token began to count down. He pushed himself to go faster, a projectile of blood leaving his lips. When Lionel awoke, he was at the bottom of the Void Library's staircase. Chapter 1451. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1451. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. We're about 200 from the goal, it'll be a few hours, probably. So, the bonus chapter won't come out until tomorrow, or the day after if I run out of time. Lionel coughed, another mouthful of blood coming out. But his gaze glowed with a feverish sort of light. The bad news was that he hadn't had time to find out anything about the spear domain. Unlike the segmented cube, the spear domain heirloom had a counterpart like the sword domain. In fact, the Sword family seemed to have an identical lineage factor to the Morales family as well. Due to this, Lionel felt that it was more likely for information about the spear domain to be available, as it seemed that it wasn't a unique treasure. In fact, it was very likely that there might be others of its kind. For all Lionel knew, there was a bow domain and a battle axe domain out there somewhere. All of this made him conclude that the Void Library would likely have information about it. The good news, though, was that he believed he had found information on what he needed to restore the segmented cube. Had exactly what Lionel needed, though it wasn't exactly the same, as he had expected, it was close enough. When the shelf life of a spatial treasure ran out, it was rarely because of space itself. There were two possibilities. One was that the force arts had degraded, and the second was that the material had degraded. Lionel had been forced to read it all, but the most important information he gained was actually from the second, where the researcher posited a method to extend the life of a spatial device. There was even a note that specified that such a method would only be worthwhile if the force arts that formed the spatial device were especially precious, like ones that took rare ingredients to form. Lionel had never needed precious materials to draw his force arts before, he only needed his force quill and nothing else. However, at the highest levels, this wasn't always possible, especially since as force arts got more and more complex, some even needing weeks, months, to even years to finish drawing. A single person couldn't possibly have enough force or stamina to finish such an endeavor. And, even if they had the stamina, the quality of their force most definitely wouldn't be enough unless they had special innate nodes, familiars, or ability indexes, or affinities that could help them cover for what would otherwise be a weakness. When Lionel read to this point, he understood where the researcher was coming from. He had thought that the force art used to draw the runes of a spatial treasure couldn't possibly surpass the material used to hold the space. But, he was using his limited views to comprehend something profound. When it came to life-grade spatial devices in specific, they were capable of housing life. The complexity of drawing the force art to support such a thing practically required recreating an entire world from scratch. This was exactly why most spatial devices couldn't house life. In that case, the materials needed to house the world weren't nearly as valuable as the force arts needed to create the world themselves. In such a situation, when the material reached the end of their shelf life, anyone would feel heartache, unless you were able to preserve it. The process was complex and unfortunately even more expensive than it was complex. But, simulating it roughly in his dream world, Lionel felt that it had about a 80 to 90% chance of succeeding. All of the fundamental principles that made up the theory were sound. Unfortunately, the process wouldn't be exactly the same. But, by virtue of that, Lionel actually believed that it might be a bit simpler. The material forming the segmented cube was far from being worn out, making the situation Lionel was dealing with far more stable. Lionel sighed. How much will this cost me? And do I even have the skill for this? My hands will need to reach a 6-dimensional designation at the bare minimum. And, I'll need a gold-grade force quill for sure. Just those two goals would take tens of millions of void points. And, considering their level, it would probably require quite a sum of void merits as well. The worst part was that this didn't even include the material he would need for the process either. It could easily end up costing him billions. That was a sum of wealth that even sector-ranked disciples wouldn't easily have, at least not without taking into consideration the assets of an entire faction, likely of at least the silver grade. Lionel exhaled another breath, spitting out the remaining blood that lingered in his mouth before weakly standing. His first priority was to take a step firmly into the realms of a silver-grade crafter, bring his hands up to standard, and buy himself a 7th-dimensional force quill. Only then could he turn his attention to the materials he would need. Then, he would have to pray that it was all worth it. Lionel's leg wobbled beneath him. He really needed some rest, some real sleep would be helpful. Luckily, Aina had said she would find them a home, so he just had to go and find her. Lionel took out another pendant and began to use it to head in the direction of Aina. The annoyance of anarchic force was especially bad when you were in a less than optimal state. Lionel, who could usually ignore it with ease, found himself struggling. He realized now why it was that so many disciples died on their own. The Void Palace was a place where you weren't allowed to be weak, even for a single moment. If you were and didn't have the backing or void points to make up the difference, you would be ruined. This frontier of humankind would run you into the ground if you weren't careful enough. Suddenly, the sound of battle caught Lionel's attention and his gaze, which had been focused on the ground, looked up. He frowned. Cross-referencing with the pendant, Aina was in that direction. Lionel tucked the pendant away and shot forward with what stamina he had left. But, what he found left him completely infuriated. Aina stood with her back straight and her axe brandished. To her back, what looked like a small home was burned to the ground, still smoldering with flames. Before her, 3 stood, 2 women and a man. The woman in the center brandished a whip as the 2 to her side seemed to be controlling a plant-like domain of vines and thorns. Every one of them was well into the 6th dimension, and 2 of them had striking green hair. Aina's clothes were charred in many places. But, where they weren't, whip-like marks were left. It was immediately obvious to Lionel that she had been within the home when it burned down. There was another crack of the whip. Aina dodged, but just a margin too slow, another cut being left in her robes and a bloody mark streaking around her shoulder. Lionel could tell that Aina's right leg was injured and she was waiting for it to heal. At the same time, she needed to wait for an opportunity to use her blood force. It was clear that these people had caught her off guard. However, whatever logic and deductions Lionel was making was thrown far to the back of his mind and happened subconsciously. Right now, he was furious. Chapter 1452. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1452. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's mind spun with the events, his senses stepping into hyperdrive. Aina had likely been within the house when she was suddenly attacked. Caught off guard, the home had collapsed onto her. For someone like Aina, a normal home collapsing wouldn't even be able to leave a dent on her. However, one that could stand in this dense anarchic force was a different matter entirely. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that if she was caught beneath the wrong avalanche, not to mention a severe injury, she could end up crippled, and there was even a small possibility of her being crushed to death. Aina managed to pull herself out, but by that point, the fire had latched itself to her and burned large segments of her robes. On top of that, her leg was broken. Before her healing factor could even deal with these things, she was surrounded by 3 galaxy-ranked disciples, 2 of which seemed to very obviously be from the Biyao family. And now, the Biyao family member brandished a whip, treating Aina like some sort of dog she was punishing. I've already said it once and I don't like to repeat myself. Sign this contract and we will let you go. It's quite simple. If you want to see how far we can take your humiliation, feel free to keep testing my patience. There are countless things I can do without killing you. In fact, if you let me go through the list one by one, you just might kill yourself before I'm through. A cold light flashed in the young woman's gaze. However, seeing the cold glare Aina was giving her, her own flashed with rage. Huh, Emily, you're a woman. Aren't you aware of how to piss off another woman best? The only one without green hair, a young man by the name of Elliot, grinned. Just spit it out. The young man laughed harder. Just look at her, even in such a state, she's actually such a beauty, and so much of her clothes have been burnt away already. Half the work is already done. Emily's brows furrowed. But, seeing the cold light in Aina's gaze and her lack of a reaction, she could easily tell that Elliot's suggestion wasn't just in the interest of their mission. However, she also couldn't deny that for a prideful person like Aina, it was the perfect tactic. The next time her whip cracked, it left a large gash across Aina's toned torso. The large cut ripped a streak across her robes, almost splitting them entirely in 2 widthwise. Don't test my patience anymore or else you'll suffer. I'm sure you heard him. I don't mind stripping you naked and tying you up to allow everyone to admire. The words had hardly begun when a furious roar drowned them out. Aina's gaze flashed, her gaze snapping toward Lionel. The 3 youths couldn't help but turn to look as well, their expressions changing. However, under the astonished view of everyone, a resounding crack echoed. Lionel, who had just begun a billowing pillar of towering fury, suddenly frozen, his crimson eyes twinkling before they began to dim. Out of his control, Lionel felt his consciousness fading. Then, he fell forward, crashing into the dried and cracked gray and black grounds. He fell unconscious. The odd change to the situation left everyone, including Aina, stunned. Lionel felt his mind spinning, the embrace of sleep clawing its fingers into him. He couldn't think or feel anything. He drifted off into a land of dreams. Lionel couldn't remember the last time he dreamed, the kind of dream that made little to no sense and yet felt so all-encompassing and real at the same time, the kind of dream where you couldn't run or jump or even speak as well as you wanted to. It wasn't until a long while later that Lionel's mind suddenly snapped awake and he remembered what he had been doing. He went from enjoying comfort to absolutely furious in the blink of an eye, his eyes snapping open and his body rising up with fury practically manifesting around him. But, when Lionel awoke, he found himself high in a tree. His sudden movement almost caused him to lose his balance and fall from a height that must have been at least 200 meters. Before he could, though, two strong hands caught him, keeping him stable. The tree branch swayed, but it remained firm. The hands only released Lionel after they were sure that he had regained his bearings. When Lionel looked up, he realized that he had been sleeping on Aina's bosom. He wasn't sure how long it had been, but she smiled back at him with a beautiful smile. Her robes were beaten and torn, not to mention burnt and ravaged in many areas, but her face radiated a healthy, happy light. Lionel blinked. She was truly gorgeous. But, remembering his fury, his brows couldn't help but furrow. What happened? Lionel listened to Aina's words. But, his fury didn't vanish. However, this time, he wasn't furious towards someone else, but rather himself. Lionel really had lost consciousness back then. His mind had already been at its limit, but then he not only used it to analyze and simulate the past with far too much detail, his fury had also forced his king's might to flood forth. All of these things were heavy loads on a mind that was already on its last legs. He couldn't just expect to magically poof more stamina into his body just because he was enraged. He was an idiot. This was the Void Palace. This place was no different from being stuck in a perpetual war zone. He couldn't afford to show weakness, ever. Even if he had to sacrifice for it, he had to always maintain at least some strength at all times if he didn't have his easily accessible to himself. Lionel's jaw clenched. As furious as he was with himself, this was already the third time now that the Vieira family had tested his bottom line. If he didn't thoroughly cripple their place in the Void Palace, he wouldn't be able to rest this smoldering heat in his chest. Chapter 1453. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1453. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's roar had ended up distracting the three galaxy-ranked disciples. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Aina launched one of the most powerful attacks she could, catching them off guard. Her attack didn't manage to have a large effect. After all, these were veterans of the sixth dimension and high-class galaxy-ranked disciples. But, she did manage to injure them just enough to take advantage of their blood force. With that, she was able to accelerate the healing of her leg, and once it was good enough to run on, she used what remained of the life force to accelerate her speed. She picked up Lionel's unconscious body and shot into the distance, entering the outskirts of the residential zones. It had been 3 days since then. Aina had been using her life force affinity to avoid them all this time. Though she didn't fear them, she didn't want to fight with Lionel unconscious. She was actually worried about him, but all her expertise told her that he was just in a deep sleep. Luckily, she had been able to stop moving Lionel around recently, as it seemed that they had stopped following her. It was either they were called away, had another obligation, or they had gotten tired of looking. It was also possible that they had expended too much energy. Sleep was much more important in the Void Palace than it was anywhere else. Sixth-dimensional existences could probably stay awake for months to years at a time without on lower-dimensional worlds. But here, not only was it the pinnacle of the seventh dimension, but it was also a place rife with anarchic force. Though it didn't seem like it, every waking moment was spent combating anarchic force. This made not only sleep, but food especially important as well. Lionel had been planning on sleeping and eating 3 days ago, but now he had been asleep for that long instead, and it was likely that Aina hadn't gotten a wink of sleep in that time either. "I'm sorry, I won't forget this," Lionel said. Aina smiled. "It's about time I carry you sometimes too, right? It almost always feels like the other way around." Lionel shook his head. Though she said this, it wasn't true. Most of the time, the two of them were side by side. "Seriously." Aina emphasized this word, pulling Lionel's face back to force him to look at her. One of the moments she felt the safest she ever had in her life was in the middle of a war zone. She could still remember the rage Lionel felt facing off against the puppet master, fighting someone so much more powerful than himself just because they dared to harm her. This was what Aina had missed the most about Lionel, and it was why her not coming to save her in her greatest time of need was exactly what snapped her personality back into her body. It wasn't that Aina wanted or needed Lionel to constantly save her, it was just the thought that he would wade through hell and high water for her sake. No matter what odds faced them, so long as said odds stood in her way, he would be the first to pierce forward. Aina's heart was still riddled with guilt. She loved this side of Lionel when it worked for her, but when he brandished his spear to save others, she had selfishly tried to hold him back. She hoped that she would have more opportunities to protect Lionel like this. He was the man she was determined to remain by the side of no matter what happened in the future. Lionel gripped Aina's wrist, nodding. But, on the inside, he had already sworn that he wouldn't allow this to happen again. Maybe this was just the difference between men and women. Lionel would never feel at ease being protected by Aina. He felt an endless desire to stand before her, to bear everything. It was a foolish masculine pride, but it was a pride he was proud of regardless. Come on, you can sleep on my back. I know you're tired. Okay. Aina said softly, letting Lionel pick her up. Soon, she was strapped comfortably to Lionel's back, her cheek pressing down on his shoulder as she almost immediately drifted off. She didn't feel a single ounce of reluctance trusting Lionel. Lionel leapt down from the tree, a starry road manifesting beneath his feet that allowed him to flutter downward. However, the cold look in his eye was nowhere near as elegant or beautiful. A thin sheen of ethereal star force coated Aina's body. Like this, she couldn't even feel or hear the harsh winds. He finished this just as he hit the ground. The moment his feet touched earth, he shot forward in a blazing light. His mind was back in top condition, running smoother than it ever had. His thoughts ran on overdrive and several ideas popped into his head as though they had presented themselves for his viewing pleasure. Many of these ideas were already things that chief strategists would be proud of, but Lionel threw them out one by one without the slightest care, only keeping the ones that were relatively decent by his standards. By the time he could see the residential area of the Void Palace again, he had come to a conclusion in his thoughts. Up ahead, he noticed, 1, 2, 4, 7 total. Almost the instant he appeared, 7 seemingly unrelated individuals had odd changes to their expressions before carefully turning and beginning to walk away. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with their actions at all, but Lionel suddenly accelerated. Appearing before the first in the blink of an eye, his fist shot outward. He didn't ask questions, he didn't double-check his conjecture, he didn't even ask them for information. His father's name made even the Void Elders quake in fear, but he wasn't his father. It seemed he would have to teach these people one by one that he could be more fearsome than even his old man. And he would start with these galaxy-ranked disciples. The sound of shattering bone echoed. Chapter 1454. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1454. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's actions were vicious and without regard. The first student shot out like a speed bullet, their chest caving inward and pieces of flesh and organ flying out of their mouths as they spit up blood. Lionel's body flickered, his speed touching realms these lower-level 6-dimensional existences couldn't even fathom, his fists radiating with bronze runes as he pummeled them down one by one. Those who happened to be lingering in the surroundings watching on with flickering gazes. Lionel didn't speak, he didn't give them a chance to explain, he didn't even seem to be looking them in the eye. He didn't even show any mercy for any of the women within the group. His palm grasped the face of a young man, slamming the back of his head into the touch ground. The latter's arm seized, reaching up into the air as he seemed to go into some sort of epileptic shock. But Lionel had already moved on, appearing before a young woman, his heel had already slammed into her temple before she registered his existence. Her head rebounded off the ground, only to be forced to come to a halt as the sole of Lionel's foot stomped downward, deforming her cheek and shattering her jaw. She reached up a hand, trying to grasp at Lionel's leg to pull him off of her. But he simply grasped her wrist, his gaze flashing with a blinding light as he pulled. A heart-rending shriek shook those watching to the core as Lionel ripped her arm from its socket, a bloodied mess pooling into the surroundings. Lionel let the arm drop, his cold, indifferent expression fading into the distance as he walked away from the scene, not sparing anyone else a glance. He hadn't done this to stop information from spreading to begin with. He had only done it for two reasons. First as a warning, and second to vent. Soon, he appeared before a Senate branch. Entering, he finally turned in the 3-star Void mission and received his rewards. The mission initially had an award of 118,000. After becoming a 1-star mission it doubled again after becoming 2-star, and it doubled once more after becoming 3-star. That gave Lionel 944,000 Void points. In addition, because it was a 3-star mission, that also gave them 3 Void merits to work with. Taking advantage of their pardon, Lionel gave the contract over to the administrator overseeing the branch and had her voided. After that process was through, Lionel turned and left. If these Void points were combined with what Lionel had taken from Orinik, he actually had nearly 5 million Void points. Towards such a thing, Lionel could only inwardly shake his head. He and Aina had put their life on the line for less than 1 million, but Orinik had made more than 4 times that, exploiting their hard work. It was no wonder he had been feeling so smug. There was still a bit more than a week and a half until Aina could turn cash in her Void merits, and it was quite obvious from what those lackeys of Triana Virer had said that this was what the latter was targeting. Aina had told Lionel that the contract was actually meant to trade her Void merits in exchange for protection services. Obviously, if Aina was handing all her Void merits to Triana, she would never be able to use the Void merit method to get out of the contract in the first place. It was an obvious trick, but it was also clear that Triana thought so little of the matter that she hadn't even bothered to hide her attempt to clearly extort Aina through threats that weren't even veiled. Right this moment, Lionel needed information. He had a whole database of laws in his mind, but he didn't know anything about Triana or what he assumed to be her faction. He didn't know if the Virer family even had a faction, honestly. For example, the Morales family didn't seem to lock themselves into one faction. From what he could tell, the Morales family never bothered to start its own faction like the Swerd family had. It seemed that the stalwart Polearm party was under the control of someone else. Regardless, none of that mattered. There were several information networks that Lionel could take advantage of. But the best one was probably related to an organization Lionel had no love lost for, Shield Cross Stars. The Sith family, the head of Shield Cross Stars' stealth unit. They were the best bet. Lionel had learned about most of these things through fourth-dimensional tier information. Things like simple history and general information like this were easily accessible to him now, so he didn't have to wander around so blind. The Sith family didn't have just one faction, as there was great competition between its younger generation as well. In fact, it had a party and a few seats in the Void Senate as well. However, Lionel probably couldn't even afford to have a party act on his behalf right now. Instead, he targeted a gold-grade faction headed by a Sith family member. They called themselves the Winding Shadow faction. There were silver and even bronze-grade factions to choose from, but Lionel felt that there was a good chance that any faction Triana was a part of was at least bronze-grade, likely silver. She was an expert on the leaderboards, after all, so she couldn't be underestimated. Lionel didn't want to take the chance of the faction he requested help from giving him false or partial information just so that they could benefit on the back end. A higher-level faction was less likely to do this. Of course, Lionel knew that it was unlikely for even a bronze faction to betray him. After all, an information center that couldn't be trusted wasn't very far from collapsing. But he still chose to go this route. In the end, half of his 5 million Void points went up in smoke. But, in return, he got information about the entire Virer family from top to bottom. Chapter 1455. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1455. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bonus chapter for 1,500 golden tickets. Next bonus chapter at 2,250 golden tickets. Oh? That happened? A light chuckle came from a training room shrouded in darkness. The spear stretched his back, basking in its cascade of crackles until he sighed in relief. This person was quite the existence. A person near the pinnacle of the sector ranked disciples and also an individual in competition to form the next legacy faction, Ronan Sith. When he heard about Lionel's request, he didn't really care much. He might have to care about the higher-ranked members of the Biyao family, but Triana was still a relative newbie, only heading a bronze faction on the verge of becoming a silver faction. Though, this was a bit misleading as the resources at Triana's fingertips could make even the best silver factions tremble. The reason was because she controlled the most lucrative field in the Void Palace, medicine. If you were a nominal, quadrant, or even a galaxy-ranked disciple, it was almost 100% guaranteed that you would need her services. Her family supported her and handed this lower-level business off to her, and she suffocated the market competition to the point others didn't dare to raise their heads. Even if many were unsatisfied, there was little to nothing they could do. If they wanted to survive and have their injuries cured in a timely fashion, they could only suck it up. Triana knew this well and took great advantage of it, upping prices, demanding exorbitant fees, and using this control over the market to begin influencing others of her level. The only reason she was still heading a bronze-ranked faction, the Green Touch faction, was because they lacked the combat-related merits to reach higher levels, but they had already ticked all of the other boxes. It was only a matter of time. In fact, if Ronan remembered correctly, they should be able to accomplish it in a month or two. This was probably why Triana was so infuriated with Aina. With her void merits taking a hit, it would take more effort and time to accomplish something that was once inevitable. Thinking to this point, his lip curled. How interesting, it seemed they would have a nice show to watch. He had originally asked to be informed about any Lionel-related information because he was very interested in Velasco, and Lionel happened to be at the center of a lot of conflict right now, more than maybe any other single person. Setting aside the Triana and White Lion Bao problem, the largest conflict currently ongoing in the Void Palace was between the Sword and Spear factions. This conflict was pretty much perpetual, but the expulsion of the stalwart Polearm Party and their demotion back to Legacy faction was like oil to the fire. There was a lot of hot blood to go around, and for someone like Ronan, this was the most interesting show to watch. It's not fun when things are too one-sided. I'm glad this Lionel has the stones and wealth to try and level the playing field. But, Triana won't be an easy opponent to deal with. Let my younger cousins in on this. There's likely going to be a ton of people wanting information on this struggle, so let them benefit. Others can't afford our prices anyway. Yes, faction head. It took Lionel only a few seconds to go through all of the information. So, it seemed that the Biyao family didn't have anyone on the Void Senate. This was good news. Lionel would have still dealt with Triana, not to mention those three who had attacked Aina, without the slightest hesitation anyway. But, this just meant that things would be less troublesome. This situation is still complex, though. If this information is correct, then the stake the Biyao family has in Triana isn't small. It's very likely that they're propping her up and accelerating her growth so that one day she can get them the seat they're missing. If Ronan could read Lionel's thoughts, he would be shocked to see that Lionel had already drawn such a conclusion. The information they gave out was bare bones. It didn't have any theories or deductions on it, just raw numbers and facts. For Lionel to reach this conclusion, and so quickly at that, without having understood the family dynamics prior to this, was shocking beyond belief. Whatever I do, then, I have to account for their reaction. The strongest faction of the Biyao family is gold-ranked. They aren't combat specialists, but their lineage factor is exceptional at area control. And, considering Triana is ranked on the leaderboard, there's little doubt that believing they can't be lethal will cause me to suffer. Lionel soon returned to where the home Aina had gotten for them burnt down. Unfortunately, this wasn't against the rules. Though Lionel had methods of using his unranked status to make them suffer, he wasn't satisfied with this alone. It would at most be a small paper cut to a behemoth like that. The flames had long since gone out and there was nothing remaining but charred fragments of wood. He stared at it for a while before turning away. He didn't plan on lifting a single finger to clean it up. He would make Triana get on her knees and clean up the pieces one by one. Then, she would buy them another home with a bright smile on her bruised face. If she didn't, Lionel wouldn't mind tying her up in the nude for everyone to admire her figure. With a flicker, Lionel vanished, his speed nothing more than a line of white gold to most until he appeared within Spear faction territory. Right now, he had time to kill until Aina woke up. The next step of his plan relied on her. Not her power, but rather her ability. The smart thing to do would probably be to get a head start on raising his finger designation. But, he really wanted to use a spear right now. What happened when he tried to enter a training room, though, left him baffled. Uncle Montez? Kid, you've been here for so long already and this is the first time you've tried to train your spear? Do you think I just have time to waste here waiting for you? Lionel's lip twitched. How was he supposed to know he was here and waiting for him? Chapter 1456. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1456. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What's with that face? Do you need a beating, brat? Lionel's expression became weirder. Uncle Montez had always been a nice guy, why did he sound so much like Wise Star Order all of a sudden? Granted, Lionel hadn't seen him for a few years since he hadn't cleared an Earth zone in a while. But, that wasn't enough for a man well into his middle ages to have such a sudden and drastic change in personality, right? The commotion Montez caused wasn't small, and it also didn't help that he was still wearing that dazzling golden armor he usually did. The Spear faction community was a neighborhood of sorts, but there were no residences. Everything in the region was tailored toward the spear and its training. In comparison to the other regions of the Void Palace Lionel had been in, this region was tidy and well kept, and it even seemed that the perpetual darkness was lifted here. There was definitely a formation of sorts protecting this region. That said, not just anyone could enter. Not only did Lionel have to display his spear force, he had to pay a fee of void points and void merits. After paying a void merit and a 100,000 void points, he gained the right to stay here for a single day. It was only after entering, though, that Lionel understood why things were like this. If he could stay here indefinitely, he wouldn't even bother to go and find a residence for himself. This place was much too luxurious. Even if it hadn't looked so nice, just the fact the anarchic force in this region seemed to be dimmed by at least tenfold was worth it. It would be far easier to recover and train in this place. But, it was also because of all of these reasons that Montez's reaction was far too over the top. He should know that Lionel had just made it here. How much quicker was he supposed to gather 100,000 void points and a void merit, exactly? Lionel looked around to find that a lot of people were looking over. Some looked toward Montez with reverence, others looked amused, but before Lionel could reconcile what was happening, the shout of a woman echoed through the skies. Montez, what did I say about stepping foot here? Shit. Get to running, kid. Montez's figure flickered and vanished. But, Lionel wasn't nearly as vast and couldn't do anything before a woman fell from the skies like a meteor. Bang! Montez had already vanished but Lionel found himself unable to move. The woman had a valiant head of bronzed hair, her skin reflecting a healthy sheen of brown and olive. However, the oddest thing was that she looked to have covered her exposed skin in oil, making several young men in the surroundings gulp. Didn't she know what kind of enticement this brought? The woman wore a short, pleated skirt, made of plates of armor. It barely covered a third of the way down her thighs, and when she swayed, the leather-like bottoms she wore were revealed, clinging tightly around the curve of her groin. On top, her chest was bandaged and pressed down firmly. She wasn't well endowed in that area, but the bulges still left quite little to the imagination. Other than this, she wore no other clothing aside from wrist guards and a ribbon to tie her hair up. In her right hand, she held a spear even taller than herself, which was saying something considering she was almost eye level with Lionel despite her gender. Of course, you would manage to notice all things if your eyes hadn't gotten stuck roaming along her chiseled abs. She managed to make Lionel wonder if he was even considered to be fit, but he then concluded that the oil was definitely a great help to her. The woman snarled, realizing that Montez had escaped before her gaze shifted and landed on Lionel. She looked him up and down, her gaze still as fierce. But, seemingly noticing that Aina was sleeping on his back, her expression suddenly softened. Forget it. Go off, he probably has something he wants to share with you. The woman shook her head, turning to leave. Miss. Lionel called out, a hint of confusion still in his eyes. Lionel smiled. I'm a bit confused, can you tell me about Uncle Montez? Oh. You call him uncle? He's probably happy about that. Lionel blinked. He had only started calling Montez uncle because he felt it was more ingratiating. It had also helped him gain some extra benefits from him. Plus, he liked Montez, and it could be said a lot of his current accomplishments were thanks to Montez, whether it was or little Tolly, not to mention little Blackstar's copy bloodline. But, this woman's words seemed to imply something else. Seeing Lionel's confusion, the woman shook her head, disdain flashing in her eye. Others might choose to keep their nose out of this, but I don't particularly care. I hate seeing things that annoy me. Lionel's lip twitched, but he didn't say anything. This woman was quite fierce. Just an annoying pair of brats. That Velasco fool also ran away before I could shove my spear up his ass. And now that Montez bastard is breaking the rules by coming here when he was very clearly kicked out of the Void Palace, he's not even meant to be here. A pair of idiot brothers, each more annoying than the last. How they managed to remain practically the same person when they've refused to talk to one another for almost decades now is beyond me. Lionel's brows shot up, his heart skipping a beat. The woman sniffed the air. I can smell the same annoying air on you. You're definitely going to cause trouble just like them. I'm watching you, brat. I have enough spears for all of you. After saying this, the woman turned and walked away, leaving Lionel in a daze. Montez was really his uncle? Chapter 1457. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1457. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel walked toward the direction Montez had gone, his gaze still flickering. If what the woman implied was true, then his dad and Montez seemed to be at odds. In that case, depending on the reason, maybe the reason Montez was acting weird was because his dad had probably done something to make the situation worse recently. Lionel wouldn't be surprised. He heard his dad was the reason the tensions between the spear and sword factions had taken such a huge turn recently, accelerating a lot of the issues the two groups had already been having. Kid, you're quite slow. You're really my uncle? Lionel ignored Montez's words and got right to the point. Montez tilted his head to the side. You're quite slow, kid. You think I just allow any random riffraff to call me uncle? You have no idea the kind of weight words hold, especially when you've reached my level. You can't just casually allow ties to form between people. Lionel blinked. Why was he always getting reprimanded by old people? Couldn't any of them be normal? He really didn't know why he hadn't seen it before, honestly. If Montez had acted like this before, he would have been the spitting image of Velasco. Both of them were insufferable, but in a special sort of "I'm only doing this for your own good" kind of way. Alright, now follow me. Montez ignored Lionel's weird expression and turned away as though this wasn't world-shattering news, also something that was identical to his father. Only Velasco would be so casual with such a large piece of information as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. You two really are brothers, Lionel laughed. Montez's head snapped back, a glare in his eyes. Oh, scary. Lionel rolled his eyes. He had spent every day of almost 18 years with his father. He had already built up enough immunity to this stuff and he had his own bag of tricks to deal with it. He didn't seem to realize, though, that he had also slipped back into his role as a child, his heart feeling light. He couldn't even remember the last time he had rolled his eyes, it just wasn't something he did. But, it just felt quite easy to be childish around his dad, and it somehow also felt natural to be like this around Montez as well. Montez's glare suddenly became a smile, a devious sort of grin. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. He also knew that look. He was just a toddler the first time he saw it, back when that old man put the first cup of that vomit brew right in front of him. Now, this face was practically an exact copy of what Lionel remembered. Oh boy, Montez turned back and soon led Lionel into a tower-like building. After passing through the reception, they entered what felt like an elevator and eventually came to a room. Large tiles of about 1 meter by 1 meter lined the floors, walls, and ceiling. They were all matte black and were somewhat soft and warm to the touch. At the center of the room, there was a kneeling table with some objects on it. Montez strolled forward and Lionel followed, the door closing after them. Turning back, Lionel couldn't even see the entrance any longer. There didn't seem to be any light in this place, but somehow there was still just enough to see around. Seeing Montez kneel at the table, Lionel carefully untied Aina from his back and kneeled as well. He thought of finding a place for her to sleep more comfortably. But she ended up rolling in her sleep and claiming his left thigh as her pillow. Montez didn't say anything about this, just looking at the items on the table. That annoying chauvinist probably didn't leave you anything about the spear, right? Lionel thought for a moment before shaking his head. His dad really hadn't left him anything obvious, but wasn't the spear domain ring still on his finger? He left the spear domain with me. It's helped me with my spear training a lot. Lionel wasn't wrong. The spear domain was probably the best trainer of the spear in all of existence, filled with tens of thousands of teachers. Montez's eyes flashed with an enraged light for a moment, but it quickly faded. I don't mean that, I mean something like he likely did with your crafting training. That chauvinist is arrogant, he thinks he's above even the spear domain. If he really cared, he would have left you personalized training. Lionel nodded. Montez was probably right. His dad really was like that. But, then again, that old man had said he'd teach him a lesson if he dared awaken his spear domain lineage factor first. So, he must really not like the spear for some reason. You're right, he left me a crafting training program, but nothing about the spear. Montez shook his head, clearly expecting this. It's no wonder you haven't grasped 6th-dimensional spear force yet. If you can't grasp it before entering the 6th dimension, they'll take it upon myself to kick you out of our family line. Lionel was speechless. He really didn't know what to do about this uncle-father pair of his. Now focus, what do you see here? Lionel's brow furrowed. Before was what looked like a xylophone mallet, a paintbrush, and an elaborately designed fountain pen and its ink. A mallet, a paintbrush and a fountain pen and an inkwell. Good, you're going to learn how to play music, write poetry, and paint for me until I'm satisfied. Lionel was left stunned. Excuse me? Did I not speak clearly enough? Lionel didn't know what to say. He had never done any of that stuff, not to mention the fact he didn't think that he would be very good at it. With his logical personality, how was he supposed to make art? Wait, that wasn't even the point. What was the use of this? What did this have to do with the spear? Distraction. Right, I need a distraction to escape from this place. Uncle Montez, who was that beautiful lady? I think she likes you, maybe you should pursue her. In my experience, women don't get so riled up about men they don't care about. Montez raised a brow. Of course she likes me, she's my wife. Lionel was thoroughly defeated. Who runs away from their wife like that? Chapter 1458. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1458. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel cleared his throat, trying to gloss over the awkward gaffe. It's nice that you're not a bachelor, having someone by your side in your old age is good. Are you calling me old, brat? Lionel smiled. I heard for Auntie that you're not supposed to be in the Void Palace at all, how'd you pull it off? Montez seemed gratified for a moment that Lionel was calling his wife Auntie. But, hearing his question, he snorted. Morales men do as they please, as if they can stop me from visiting my wife and nephew if I want. Your wife doesn't seem to want you to visit, though. Montez seemed to blush for a moment, but he quickly recovered. What do you know? That woman told me not to appear before her again until I decided to put a baby inside her. She's crazy. Lionel sputtered, rolling his lips over each other to stop himself from laughing any harder. He realized that finding his uncle's weakness was the same as finding his father's weakness. Velasco was lucky that Lionel hadn't known his mother for most of his life, but now that he did, he wouldn't let that old man off next time he saw him. Then just put a baby in her. Don't tell me you're impotent, UNC? Montez's expression darkened. Who's impotent? My vitality could run circles around yours. You're lucky I'm a married man, or else I'd take you to the closest brothel and bury you. Lionel laughed so hard his vision blurred. The role models in his family seemed to really be top-notch. It was no wonder their wives had such a tight leash on him. Luckily, he was a much better man and hadn't stumbled into these degenerate ways. Montez shook his head. You did a good job distracting me, but you're not getting out of this one. Montez snapped his fingers and Lionel's teleportation attempt shattered, leaving his face sunken. How'd you find out? Lionel practically pouted. You think that you hide anything from me within my absolute domain? You'd better forget about running away. You're going to sit here until I'm satisfied, and you're going to continue coming here as well, or else I want mine spanking you in front of your little girlfriend. Lionel sighed and shook his head. What is the point of all of this? If you're really capable, go and take your rage out on that old man. Why are you torturing me? Snap. Lionel winced, rubbing his forehead. Montez had moved faster than he could track, flicking his forehead so hard he was almost certain that a lump would form if not for his starry-tailed fox lineage factor. Oh. That's not a bad bloodline, surprising for that trash family. I bet it still hurts, though. There's more where that came from too if you keep wagging your tongue. Lionel rubbed his forehead, realizing that he wasn't going to get out of this. How annoying. He didn't have a single artistic bone in his body. How was he supposed to do this, exactly? And how was this going to be helpful? Painting and calligraphy wouldn't be hard. Lionel was fairly certain that he could copy perfectly. However, he had a feeling that his uncle wanted him to do much more than just copy. You've almost reached full mastery of your... Wait. I don't want to hear about future and current spear forces. I want to comprehend them all on my own. Hearing this, Montez's expression flickered, his brow furrowing before loosening. Then, he laughed, his booming voice almost shattering the protective sheen around Aina and nearly making Lionel's ears bleed. Fine. You've almost reached full mastery of your fifth-dimensional spear force. How would you describe it? Controlled range. Montez blinked. I've never heard it summed up in 2 words before, but this is probably the most correct explanation I've ever heard at the same time. The spear is not just about being able to kill enemies from a larger range. It is the king of the battlefield, a general's weapon, because it represents not elegance, not fancy tricks, not flair, but rather a dominion. Within the range of a spear, nothing should be able to enter without dying, and nothing should be able to get close without your permission. That, controlled range, is your spear domain. But, I can see at a glance that your control is lacking. You have no discipline and no method of honing it. Lionel shook his head. Him? Lacking control? That was probably the one thing he had in spades. He didn't understand or agree with this conclusion at all. Someone else might eat up the words someone so much stronger than they were saying, but Lionel was known for his stubbornness and he didn't like accepting things he couldn't under the purpose of. He had even spent so long in the Four Seasons realm all because he couldn't understand why the heavenly body realm had to come next, and only barely accepted it and broke through after Wise Star Order explained it to him. Quite simply put, he would need more than this. Plus, didn't his uncle just say the spear didn't have any elegance, fancy tricks or flair? What was poetry, music and painting if not exactly those 3 things? He was already contradicting himself. Montez sighed. A man needs to have a hard exterior, but his heart must be boundless. The spear is just the same. It is the weapon of a man willing to place everything on his shoulders, but the root of that is just as important as its outcome. The method by which you go about it is maybe even more important. Simplicity itself isn't beautiful. It's simplicity that has roots in complexity that is beautiful. If I describe my emotions to you, I can easily say, I am angry. That is simple, that will get the point across, but it lacks any sort of beauty. However, if I say, Montez's palm flipped over, revealing a calligraphy pen. He unfurled a sheet of paper, his demeanor shifting and a mark of dignity appearing between his brows. His wrist flexed, his pen racing across the paper. Thunder claps to the beating of my heart. The world remains ignorant to my thoughts. Lionel squinted, the forceful strokes making his eyes sting. 2 simple phrases, barely 5 times the number of words, but the depth is infinitely greater. At the same time, Montez's arm shot forward, his pen stopping a mere 1/10 of a centimeter from Lionel's brows. Lionel's hair blew back, a bead of sweat falling down his forehead and dripping onto the tip of the pen. The strength beyond the strike gains the same profoundness. Chapter 1459. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1459. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. In a few moments, Lionel could think of quite a few interpretations of his uncle's words, the most important and profound of which was the dichotomy between the presence of a clap of thunder, compared to the irony of the world's ignorance. The clap of thunder was supposedly the subject's beating heart, and everyone could so clearly hear it, and yet they had no idea just what that represented. Whatever hidden rage and fury that caused the skies to quake was still bottled away, hidden in the tip of the very pen before him. It was a powerful imagery, and it made Lionel somewhat understand what his uncle was trying to say. The spear was a steady and controlled weapon, but that didn't mean that the intent behind it had to be. In fact, if the intent behind it was too shallow, then it also made the spear weak. It was just like what his uncle had said about being a man. It was good if a man was willing to take on burdens and weigh down his shoulders. But, if he didn't have a good reason for doing so, if his resolve was weak and lacking, then his back would easily break. Montez wanted Lionel's spear to be steady, swallowing up all its elegance and flair, and exploding it forth in a single strike. The calligraphy pen teaches the weight of words, but not just that. It teaches you how to embody the meaning and feel of those words into strokes. They're not just words, they are strikes of your spear. Montez unfurled another sheet of paper. They can be forceful. They can be subtle. They can be swift. They can be gentle. With every emphasized word, he wrote another, his strokes changing like the wind. Lionel's eyes glazed over, he could almost see the pen as a spear and the stance of his uncle, his style morphing on a whim and without the slightest pause. The variations made what Lionel had learned from the primitive woman seem like a joke. He couldn't change like this, he lacked the proper sort of intent. These 4 words are the ones you will start with. Until you can replicate the intent to my liking, I won't let you continue to do other things, at least not related to this. What happened to poetry? Lionel asked. Poetry? You can't even understand the intent behind single words, how can you string them together? Words. Lionel's gaze flashed. He suddenly thought back to his battle with Miguel. That cousin of his had the habit of speaking out single words before he attacked. Could it be? After hesitating, Lionel decided to ask. He had originally thought that was Miguel's ability index or something related to it, but then Miguel exposed his devour-type ability index, so Lionel never got the answer he wanted. And, after that, so many things happened that he had forgotten to ask. Ah, I see. This Miguel is interesting. Montez scratched his chin, smiling. He suddenly wanted to learn a bit more about this Miguel. The truth of the matter is that this method of training the spear was self-created by your grandfather. I refined it somewhat after I matured, and your father always ignored it, insisting on doing things his own way. He doesn't even use his spear 90% of the time. Montez shook his head, stopping himself from going on another rant about Velasco. However, just because it is created by our family line, doesn't mean that others might not have thought of similar methods. This Miguel is quite the genius. You, though, my little nephew, seem to be a bit dumb. Lionel's lip twitched. Was that necessary? It wasn't that he was stupid, but his mentality wasn't right to think of such a method on his own. Maybe I am a bit slow, Lionel laughed at himself. With how important artistic conception is to strength in this world, I should have guessed that there was such a method. But, if it was me, I wouldn't choose poetry, painting or music. I would choose to use force arts. In Lionel's opinion, the beauty of a force art was far beyond poetry, painting or music. But, the difficulty in creating an artistic conception through force arts was several times more difficult. Force arts were the foundation of life and being. If Lionel wanted to give it life, it would quite literally be like creating life. Lionel picked up the calligraphy pen, ready to start. But, his uncle's palm stopped him. Hold on, now. If I don't give you other tasks, you'll probably end up slamming your head against a wall trying to get this right. The only way for you to stay sane is by switching between tasks. Creativity isn't like any other training you've ever done, the drain is far heavier than a monotonous task. It's even more important, then, that you know how to switch when you've reached your limit. The next thing I will show you is the power of rhythm and music. Montez's palm flipped over to reveal another mallet. But, this one had a golden ball on the end of it that radiated with mysterious ruins. Montez clasped his palms together, his demeanor shifting once again. At that moment, a flood of earth force surged. Montez opened up his clasped palms, radiant earth force taking root in the air and suddenly forming illusory keys. They shimmering with a resplendent silvery bronze. With a slight movement, Montez's arm rose, his wrist flicking and striking down. Dong! Lionel's eyes widened. Montez's force hadn't even formed physical metal, but it struck the force as though he had. He never thought that something like that was even possible. However, Lionel soon lost himself entirely. The first strike seemed to be nothing more than a test, it echoed through the room and fused with the walls, making Lionel feel as though his whole rib cage was vibrating. But, the following strikes were much more peaceful. Lionel found himself breathing to the rhythm of the music. And then, he felt like he couldn't even hear the music at all, but rather than he had been transported to an entirely new world, one where a man stood alone in the face of an army with nothing more than a single spear to his side. His hair fluttered, his eyes losing focus. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.